Welcome, seeker of shadows, to a journey through the deepest darkness of human transformation, where innocence dies in prison cells and legends are forged in pain. Tonight, we descend into the tragic chronicle of the man who broke the bat, whose story begins not with evil, but with a child born into hell itself. Let the sound of distant waves against Caribbean shores and the echo of prison walls carry you into restful slumber as we explore the complete saga of Bane, from his first breath in Peñaduro to his final confrontation with Gotham's Guardian, in the azure waters of the Caribbean Sea, where trade winds carry both the promise of paradise and the whispers of ancient sorrows. There lies an island whose beauty masks a legacy of perpetual struggle and political upheaval that has shaped its character across centuries of colonial exploitation and revolutionary ferment. This is Santa Prisca, a jewel of emerald mountains and pristine beaches that has known the boots of conquistadors and the dreams of freedom fighters. A land rich in natural resources yet eternally poor in peace, where the cycle of oppression and rebellion has turned like the wheels of some cosmic machine, designed to crush the hopes of generations beneath its inexorable weight. The island's strategic position in the Caribbean made it a coveted prize for European powers who recognized its potential as both a way station for their colonial empires and a source of the exotic materials that fueled the engines of imperial expansion. Spanish galleons had first claimed these shores in the name of distant monarchs who viewed the island merely as another dot on the maps that decorated their palace walls. Yet the indigenous peoples who had called this place home for millennia before the arrival of sail-powered invaders possessed a different understanding of what it meant to belong to land rather than to own it. The conquest that followed was neither quick nor complete, for the mountains of Santa Prisca provided refuge for those who refused to accept the yoke of foreign domination, and the dense tropical forests became sanctuaries where the flame of resistance could be kept alive through generations of struggle against overwhelming odds. The Spanish found that taking an island was one thing, but holding it against a population that knew every hidden path and secret cave required resources and vigilance that strained even their vast imperial apparatus. Yet as decades turned to centuries, the colonial system took root through the familiar mechanisms of cultural suppression and economic exploitation that had proven effective across the Spanish territories of the New World. Churches were built to replace indigenous spiritual sites. Spanish became the language of commerce and government, and the traditional ways of life that had sustained the island's people for countless generations were systematically dismantled and replaced with systems designed to extract wealth for distant beneficiaries. The French arrived later, bringing their own vision of colonial administration and their own methods of exploitation, viewing the Spanish hold on Santa Prisca as an opportunity to expand their Caribbean empire through conquest disguised as liberation. The wars that followed left scars across the island's landscape and its people's collective memory, as European powers treated Santa Prisca as a chess piece in their global struggle for dominance, caring nothing for the lives disrupted and destroyed by their imperial ambitions. The Dutch, ever practical in their approach to empire, saw in Santa Prisca's strategic location and natural harbors an opportunity to establish trading posts and commercial enterprises that could serve their growing mercantile network. Their period of control brought different forms of exploitation, focused more on commerce than territorial administration, yet no less destructive to the island's traditional social structures and cultural identity. Through all these successive occupations, something remarkable persisted in the hearts and minds of Santa Prisca's people, an unquenchable desire for genuine independence that transcended mere changes in colonial administration, the dream of true freedom, of determining their own destiny without reference to the interests of distant powers, became woven into the fabric of the island's cultural identity like golden threads in a tapestry of resistance. It was from this tradition of rebellion that the revolutionary movement emerged in the 19th century, led by men and women who understood that political independence required not just the expulsion of foreign armies, but the creation of institutions and systems that could serve the needs of their own people rather than external masters. The movement's leadership passed from generation to generation like a sacred trust, each inheriting not just the responsibility of continuing the struggle, but the accumulated wisdom of those who had fought and died for the cause of liberty. Among these hereditary leaders arose a figure whose vision and charisma marked him as perhaps the most formidable revolutionary Santa Prisca had yet produced. A man whose tactical brilliance and unwavering commitment to the cause of independence made him legendary among his followers and feared by the colonial authorities who recognized in him a threat unlike any they had previously encountered. This was the man who would become the father of the child destined to be known as Bane, though the circumstances of that child's birth would be shaped by tragedy in ways that no amount of revolutionary fervor could prevent. The Revolutionary Leaders' Campaign for Independence was based on principles that went beyond simple nationalism to encompass a vision of social justice that would address the economic inequalities and cultural suppression that had characterized centuries of colonial rule. He understood that true liberation required not just political independence, but the creation of a society where the island's resources served its people rather than foreign investors, where education and opportunity were available to all, rather than reserved for a privileged elite connected to colonial power structures. His military strategy combined traditional guerrilla warfare tactics with innovative approaches that took advantage of Santa Prisca's mountainous terrain and the intimate knowledge of local geography possessed by fighters who had grown up exploring every valley and ridge. The movement's forces operated like shadows in the jungle, striking swiftly at vulnerable targets before melting back into landscapes they knew better than any foreign army could hope to learn. Yet it was not merely military prowess that made this revolutionary leader so formidable, but his ability to articulate a vision of the future that inspired ordinary people to extraordinary acts of courage and sacrifice. His speeches, delivered in hidden camps and secret gatherings, painted pictures of an independent Santa Prisca where children could grow up free from the fear of foreign domination, where the island's natural beauty would serve the pleasure of its own people rather than distant tourists, where the profits from its resources would build schools and hospitals rather than fill the coffers of colonial administrators. Among those inspired by this vision was a woman whose beauty was matched only by her fierce commitment to the cause of independence, a revolutionary in her own right, who had proven her courage in countless operations against colonial forces. Her love for the movement's leader was inseparable from her dedication to their shared dream of freedom, creating a bond that was both intensely personal and profoundly political, a relationship forged in the crucible of shared struggle and mutual dedication to principles that transcended individual happiness. Their courtship took place in the context of military campaigns and clandestine meetings, stolen moments of tenderness amid the constant danger that defined their lives as leaders of an underground movement. Yet, their love was not diminished by these circumstances, but rather strengthened by the knowledge that they fought not just for abstract principles, but for the possibility of building a life together in a free Santa Prisca where their children could grow up without knowing the bitter taste of foreign domination. The marriage ceremony that united them was conducted in secret, attended only by their most trusted comrades, yet it carried symbolic weight that extended far beyond the personal happiness of the couple involved. Their union represented the joining of two of the movement's most important families, the consolidation of revolutionary leadership under a partnership that combined tactical brilliance with unwavering moral commitment to the cause of independence. The early years of their marriage were marked by a series of spectacular military successes that brought the revolutionary movement closer to its goals than it had ever been before. Victories that demonstrated not just the tactical skill of their forces, but the growing popular support for independence among ordinary islanders who had grown weary of colonial exploitation. Government buildings were seized and held, colonial officials were captured or driven from their posts, and entire regions of the island fell under revolutionary control. Yet even as military victories accumulated, both leaders understood that their ultimate goal required more than successful battles. It demanded the creation of institutions and systems that could govern an independent Santa Prisca according to principles of justice and equality that had motivated their struggle from the beginning. They spent countless hours in planning sessions that looked beyond immediate tactical concerns to address questions of education, economic development, and social organization that would determine whether their revolution would create genuine freedom or merely replace foreign domination with domestic tyranny. It was during this period of revolutionary success and forward planning that the woman discovered she was carrying the child who would become Bane, a pregnancy that filled both parents with joy despite the dangerous circumstances that surrounded their lives. The prospect of bringing a child into the world while still fighting for that world's freedom created complex emotions, mixing anticipation and worry in ways that reflected the fundamental uncertainty that defined their existence as revolutionary leaders. The father's response to news of the pregnancy revealed aspects of his character that went beyond his public role as a military commander and political visionary. His tender concern for his wife's health and safety, his excitement about the prospect of fatherhood, and his dreams of the kind of upbringing he wanted to provide for their child, showed a man whose capacity for love was as deep as his commitment to revolutionary principles. Yet circumstances would not permit the luxury of a normal pregnancy or peaceful preparation for parenthood. The colonial authorities, alarmed by the movement's recent successes and desperate to reassert control over an increasingly rebellious population, launched a massive counter-offensive designed to crush the independence movement through overwhelming force and systematic terrorism against anyone suspected of supporting the revolutionary cause. The campaign that followed was marked by atrocities that violated even the loose standards of conduct that had previously governed the conflict between colonial forces and independence fighters. Villages suspected of harboring revolutionaries were burned. Civilians were tortured for information about rebel activities, and entire families were executed as examples to others who might consider supporting the cause of independence. In this climate of escalating violence and desperate struggle, the revolutionary forces found themselves increasingly isolated and outnumbered, forced to retreat from positions they had held for months or years as colonial reinforcements arrived from other parts of the empire. The dream of independence that had seemed so close to realization began to fade as military realities imposed themselves upon revolutionary aspirations with ruthless efficiency. The final battle that sealed the fate of the independence movement took place in circumstances that seemed almost designed by cruel destiny to maximize the tragedy of defeat. Government forces, armed with superior weapons and backed by naval artillery, surrounded the revolutionaries in a valley that had long served as one of their most secure strongholds, cutting off escape routes and systematically destroying defensive positions that had taken months to construct. The revolutionary leader fought with desperate courage, knowing that defeat would mean not just the end of his political dreams, but the destruction of everything he had worked to build, and the likely death of everyone who had followed him. His tactical brilliance was evident even in defeat, as he organized defensive actions that allowed many of his followers to escape the encirclement, despite overwhelming odds against success. Yet no amount of military skill could overcome the fundamental disparity in resources and manpower that characterized the final phase of the conflict. One by one, the revolutionary positions fell to government assault, until only a small group of the most dedicated fighters remained to continue resistance in the face of certain death or capture. The pregnant woman fought beside her husband until the very end, her condition making her movements awkward, yet her determination undimmed by the knowledge that she carried within her body the next generation of their bloodline. Her capture came only after she had exhausted her ammunition and seen her husband fall wounded at her side, his blood mixing with the soil of the island he had dreamed of liberating. The trial that followed their capture was a mockery of justice, a carefully orchestrated performance designed not to determine guilt or innocence, but to demonstrate the futility of resistance against colonial authority. The charges brought against the surviving revolutionaries were broad enough to encompass virtually any action taken in support of independence, while the sentences handed down were intended to serve as permanent warnings to anyone who might consider following their example. Among the cruelest aspects of the colonial legal system was the principle that criminal sentences could be inherited by family members, ensuring that revolutionary activities would bring consequences that extended beyond the immediate participants to encompass their children and grandchildren. This legal doctrine served multiple purposes. It provided practical solutions to the problem of overcrowded prisons, while also creating generational punishment that would theoretically deter future revolutionary activities by making entire families pay for the political choices of individual members. The pregnant revolutionary woman found herself sentenced not just for her own activities, but as heir to the unpaid debt of punishment owed by her husband, who had died of his wounds before the trial could be completed. The mathematics of colonial justice determined that her unborn child would inherit the remainder of this sentence, ensuring that the next generation would pay for the political dreams of the previous one. The prison ship that carried her away from Santa Prisca toward the fortress of Peña Duro was crowded with other revolutionaries and their family members, a cargo of broken dreams and shattered hopes that represented the final defeat of the independence movement that had seemed so promising just months before. The pregnant woman's last view of her homeland was of mountains shrouded in mist, beautiful and unreachable as the freedom for which so many had died. Peña Duro itself was a monument to the colonial understanding of justice as punishment rather than rehabilitation, a fortress prison built on a rocky outcrop surrounded by shark-infested waters that made escape impossible and hope a luxury that few inmates could afford to maintain. The facility had been designed by engineers who understood that its primary purpose was not to house criminals temporarily, but to remove them permanently from any possibility of returning to normal life. The cells that awaited the pregnant woman and her fellow revolutionaries were barely large enough for single occupants, yet they were forced to accommodate multiple prisoners in conditions that violated basic standards of human dignity. The daily flooding that occurred with each high tide served practical purposes of waste removal, while also ensuring that sleep was never restful, as inmates had to find ways to keep themselves above water during the hours when the sea reclaimed the lower portions of their cells. It was in this environment of systematic degradation and calculated suffering that the child destined to become Bane entered the world, his first breath drawing air thick with the stench of human misery and institutional cruelty. His mother's labor was attended only by fellow prisoners, whose medical knowledge consisted of whatever folk wisdom they had acquired during their lives outside the prison walls. Yet their care for her was genuine, despite the impossible circumstances that surrounded them all. The birth itself was both miracle and tragedy, proof of life's stubborn persistence in the face of conditions designed to crush hope, while also marking the beginning of an existence that would be shaped by forces beyond any individual's power to control or redirect. The child's first cries echoed through stone corridors that had heard similar sounds countless times before, adding another voice to the chorus of human suffering that provided the prison's constant soundtrack. His mother's joy at finally holding her son was mixed with despair at the circumstances that would define his upbringing. Knowledge that this child would grow to consciousness in an environment that turned human beings into animals and crushed noble aspirations under the weight of institutional brutality. Yet she cradled him with all the tenderness that any mother feels for her newborn, whispering promises about the world beyond prison walls that she knew he might never see. The name she gave him carried hopes that seemed almost absurd in the context of their surroundings. Yet she spoke it with conviction born of maternal love that transcended rational assessment of their circumstances. She told him stories of his father's courage and the cause that had brought them to this place, painting pictures of the island paradise that was his birthright, even though he would likely never walk freely upon its beaches or explore its mountain trails. The early months of his life were sustained by his mother's fierce determination to provide him with whatever nurture and protection were possible within the constraints of their imprisonment. She shared her meager food rations with him, sacrificed her own comfort to ensure his warmth, and created small pockets of tenderness and safety in the midst of an environment designed to eliminate such human consolations. Yet even maternal love could not indefinitely sustain life under conditions that systematically wore down both physical health and psychological resilience. The woman who had once fought with rifle in hand for the independence of her homeland found herself gradually weakening under the combined assault of inadequate nutrition, unsanitary living conditions, and the crushing weight of despair that settled over prisoners who realized that their sentences had no expiration date. Her decline was evident to fellow inmates who watched with growing alarm as the woman who had been one of their strongest spirits began to fade like a flower cut from its roots and left to wither in darkness. The child sensed his mother's deterioration in ways that went beyond conscious understanding, responding to her increasing frailty with the kind of desperate clinging that infants exhibit when their primary source of security and sustenance is threatened. The end came with the cruel suddenness that characterizes death in places where life is held cheaply and human dignity is systematically destroyed by institutional design. One morning, the child awakened to find his mother unresponsive, her body still warm, but her spirit finally freed from the suffering that had defined her existence since the revolution's defeat. The disposal of her remains followed procedures established by prison authorities who had long experience in handling the routine death of inmates whose punishment extended beyond their natural lifespans. Her body was carried from the cell she had shared with her son and other prisoners, taken to the edge of the rocky platform on which Peñaduro stood, and thrown into waters where the sharks that served as the prison's outer perimeter waited with patient hunger. The 6-year-old child who witnessed this final indignity suffered trauma that would shape his understanding of human nature and institutional power in ways that went far beyond conscious memory or rational analysis. The sight of his mother's body disappearing beneath waves that turned briefly red before resuming their eternal blue marked the end of whatever innocence might have survived his birth into captivity, and the beginning of a psychological transformation that would ultimately produce the man known as Bane. Yet even in this moment of ultimate abandonment and horror, seeds of his future strength were planted in soil made fertile by suffering that would have broken weaker spirits entirely. The rage that filled his small body was not the temporary anger of a child, frustrated by circumstances beyond his understanding, but rather the cold fury of someone who recognizes that the world operates according to principles of power and cruelty that must be mastered rather than merely endured. The other inmates who witnessed his response to his mother's death saw in his reaction something that set him apart from ordinary children, a quality of contained violence and calculating intelligence that suggested capacities far beyond his chronological age. They began to treat him with a mixture of protectiveness and wariness, recognizing that this child possessed within him the potential for either great evil or extraordinary achievement, depending upon how circumstances shaped the development of his remarkable capabilities. In the aftermath of his mother's death, the child who would become Bane found himself adrift in an ocean of human cruelty, where survival demanded the rapid abandonment of childhood innocence and the accelerated development of instincts that could navigate the treacherous currents of prison hierarchy and institutional violence. The other inmates of Peña Duro, hardened by years of systematic brutalization and conditioned to view compassion as a luxury that could prove fatal in moments of crisis, nonetheless recognized in this orphaned boy something that transcended their usual calculations of threat and opportunity. The transformation from helpless child to calculating survivor began with small lessons in the mathematics of power that governed every interaction within the prison's stone walls, where weakness invited predation and strength commanded respect, measured in degrees of fear rather than affection. The boy learned to read the subtle signs that preceded violence, to recognize which inmates possessed genuine authority and which merely projected false confidence that would crumble under pressure, to distinguish between those who might become allies and those who would inevitably become enemies. His education in survival came not through formal instruction but through careful observation of the complex social dynamics that structured daily life in an environment where traditional moral restraints had been systematically stripped away by the relentless pressure of institutional dehumanization. He watched as stronger inmates established territories within the common areas, noted how coalitions formed and dissolved according to shifting balances of power and mutual advantage, absorbed the unspoken rules that governed everything from food distribution to sleeping arrangements. The physical changes that accompanied his psychological development were equally dramatic, as the deprivations and stresses of prison life forged his growing body into something harder and more resilient than normal childhood would have produced. The inadequate nutrition that stunted the growth of many inmates seemed somehow to concentrate rather than diminish his vital forces, creating a compact frame that carried surprising strength beneath its deceptively modest exterior. His intellectual capabilities, inherited from parents whose strategic brilliance had nearly succeeded in overthrowing colonial authority, found expression in the systematic analysis of every aspect of his environment and the methodical accumulation of knowledge that could serve practical purposes in the endless struggle for survival. He learned to identify the individual weaknesses and strengths of every inmate in his section of the prison, to predict patterns of behavior that could be exploited or avoided, to recognize opportunities for advancement within the brutal hierarchy that determined access to resources and protection. The first test of these developing capabilities came during his adolescent years, when physical maturation made him a target for predators who had previously ignored him as too young and small to warrant their attention. The inmates who approached him with intentions that violated even the minimal standards of decency maintained within the prison walls made the fatal error of assuming that his youth and apparent vulnerability indicated helplessness rather than carefully concealed strength. The confrontation that followed would become legend within Peña Duro, not merely for its violence but for the cold calculation that characterized the boy's response to a threat that could have destroyed him if handled with conventional approaches to self-defense. Rather than relying on raw aggression or desperate flailing that might have temporarily deterred his attackers while ultimately ensuring his destruction, He applied intelligence to violence in ways that demonstrated tactical sophistication far beyond his chronological age. The death that resulted from this confrontation was neither accidental nor committed in the heat of uncontrollable rage, but rather represented the deliberate application of lethal force in circumstances where lesser responses would have proven inadequate to eliminate a threat that would otherwise have persisted and escalated. The boy's analysis of the situation had revealed that mercy or restraint would be interpreted as weakness, inviting future attacks that would eventually overwhelm even his growing capabilities. The prison warden's response to this incident reflected both recognition of the boy's remarkable capabilities and concern about the implications of allowing such a dangerous individual to develop without proper constraints. The name Bane that was bestowed upon him carried connotations that went beyond simple identification to encompass acknowledgement of his potential to become a source of destruction that could threaten the carefully maintained equilibrium upon which institutional control depended. Yet the very notoriety that made him a target for official attention also began to attract the interest of inmates whose own survival strategies were based upon forming alliances with individuals who possessed qualities that complemented their own weaknesses. The first of these relationships developed with a man known only as Bird, whose American origins and extensive knowledge of the outside world made him valuable as a source of information about realities beyond the prison walls. Bird's background as a former military operative who had been captured during covert operations in Santa Prisca provided him with skills and perspectives that proved invaluable in navigating the complexities of prison politics, while also serving as an informal mentor whose guidance helped shape the boy's understanding of strategy and tactics. The older man recognized in his young protege not merely raw potential, but the kind of exceptional intelligence that could be developed into genuine tactical genius through proper cultivation and challenge. The relationship that developed between them transcended simple mutual exploitation to encompass something approaching paternal guidance, though it was guidance focused entirely upon the development of capabilities that would ensure survival and eventual dominance, rather than conventional, moral, or ethical instruction. Bird taught lessons in observation and analysis, in the reading of human nature, and the manipulation of circumstances, in the transformation of knowledge into power through strategic application. The second member of this emerging inner circle was a figure known as Zombie, whose medical knowledge and pharmaceutical expertise made him invaluable in an environment where official healthcare was essentially non-existent, and inmates were forced to rely upon whatever folk remedies and underground medical practice could be maintained within the constraints of institutional neglect. His background remained mysterious, though his evident education and sophisticated understanding of human anatomy suggested origins in legitimate medical practice before circumstances had brought him to Peñaduro. Zombie's contribution to the boy's education focused upon the systematic understanding of human physiology and the ways that knowledge of biological systems could be weaponized for both offensive and defensive purposes. He taught lessons in anatomy that revealed precisely where and how to inflict maximum damage with minimal effort, in pharmacology that explained how various substances could be used to enhance performance or incapacitate enemies, in psychology that illuminated the connections between physical condition and mental state. The third and final member of this formative alliance was Trog, whose massive physical strength and straightforward approach to problem-solving provided a necessary complement to the more cerebral contributions of his companions. His loyalty, once earned through demonstration of superior capability and strategic vision, proved absolute in ways that made him invaluable as an enforcer whose presence could deter challenges while also serving as a reliable instrument for the implementation of more complex plans. The The dynamic that developed among these four individuals represented a perfect synthesis of complementary capabilities, each member contributing essential elements to a collective that was far more formidable than the sum of its individual parts. The boy who had been named Bane emerged as the natural leader of this group, not through assertion of dominance, but through demonstration that his intelligence and strategic vision could maximize the effectiveness of their combined resources while minimizing the risks inherent in their dangerous environment. Under his guidance, this informal alliance began to establish control over increasingly larger portions of the prison's social and economic systems, extending their influence through careful cultivation of relationships with key individuals, while systematically neutralizing potential threats before they could develop into serious challenges to their growing authority. The methods they employed combined conventional intimidation with sophisticated psychological manipulation, creating an atmosphere where compliance with their directives seemed like the rational choice rather than submission to superior force. The transformation of Peñaduro's internal dynamics under their influence was gradual but inexorable, as traditional power structures that had been based primarily upon individual physical prowess or family connections gave way to a more organized and systematic approach to institutional control. The boys' emerging philosophy of leadership emphasized the importance of intelligence gathering, strategic planning, and long-term thinking over the reactive and often self-defeating approaches that had previously characterized inmate behavior. His growing reputation for tactical brilliance and ruthless efficiency began to attract followers who recognized that association with his organization offered better prospects for survival and advancement than any alternative arrangement available within the prison's brutal ecosystem. These recruits were carefully screened and gradually integrated into an expanding network that extended its influence through multiple levels of the institutional hierarchy. The prison guards, who had initially viewed the boy as simply another inmate to be managed and controlled, found themselves dealing with someone whose growing power within the institutional system created complications that their traditional methods were inadequate to address. His ability to organize other inmates in ways that could either facilitate or disrupt official operations gave him leverage that transformed his relationship with authority from simple subordination to something approaching negotiation between rival powers. The systematic study program that he developed during this period reflected his understanding that intellectual development was as important as physical strength in determining long-term success in any competitive environment. Through relationships with inmates who possessed various forms of specialized knowledge, he gained access to educational resources that would have been unavailable to most prisoners, gradually building a foundation of learning that encompassed everything from classical philosophy to modern military strategy. The books that were smuggled into the prison through networks that he helped establish and maintain became the building blocks of an intellectual edifice that would eventually encompass virtually every field of human knowledge relevant to the exercise of power and the conduct of warfare. He absorbed information with the desperate intensity of someone who understood that knowledge might literally mean the difference between life and death. Yet he also demonstrated the kind of systematic approach to learning that characterized genuine scholarship. His studies in history revealed patterns of conquest and resistance that provided frameworks for understanding both his own situation and the broader forces that shaped human civilization, while his exploration of philosophy introduced him to questions about the nature of power, justice, and individual responsibility that would influence his worldview throughout his adult life. Military treatises from various cultures and historical periods provided practical insights into strategy and tactics that could be adapted to the unique circumstances of prison warfare. The psychological texts that formed another major component of his informal curriculum taught him to understand the deeper motivations and fears that drove human behavior, knowledge that proved invaluable in predicting how individuals would respond to various forms of pressure and incentive. This understanding of human nature became one of his most potent weapons, allowing him to manipulate situations and relationships in ways that seemed almost supernatural to those who witnessed their effects without understanding their underlying logic. The mathematical and scientific works that he studied with equal intensity provided him with analytical tools that could be applied to problems of organization and resource allocation, transforming intuitive insights about efficiency and optimization into systematic approaches that could be taught to subordinates and applied consistently across various situations. His growing mastery of these disciplines gave him capabilities that set him apart from other prisoners whose intelligence, however formidable, lacked the systematic development that transformed raw ability into genuine expertise. Yet perhaps the most significant aspect of his intellectual development during this period was his growing ability to synthesize information from diverse sources into coherent strategic visions that could guide practical action in complex and rapidly changing circumstances. This synthetic capability, combined with his exceptional memory and analytical skills, made him increasingly formidable as both a planner and an improviser who could adapt to unexpected developments without losing sight of long-term objectives. The physical training regimen that complemented his intellectual studies was equally systematic and demanding, designed not merely to build strength and endurance, but to develop the kind of comprehensive physical capabilities that could serve multiple purposes in various combat situations. His approach to physical development reflected the same analytical mindset that characterized his intellectual pursuits, treating the human body as a complex system that could be optimized through careful attention to the relationships between different forms of exercise, nutrition, and recovery. The meditation practices that formed another crucial component of his daily routine were drawn from various philosophical and religious traditions, adapted to serve the practical purpose of developing mental discipline and emotional control under extreme stress. These practices, combined with his studies in psychology, gave him unprecedented ability to maintain clarity of thought and purposeful action, even in circumstances that would overwhelm most individuals with fear, anger, or despair. The dreams that haunted his sleep throughout this period of development took on increasingly symbolic significance as he learned to interpret them not merely as random products of an unconscious mind, but as manifestations of deeper truths about his destiny and purpose. The recurring image of a demonic bat creature that had terrified him as a small child gradually transformed in his understanding from a source of fear into a prophetic vision that revealed his ultimate mission in life. The interpretation of this vision that emerged through years of study and meditation suggested that the bat represented not merely an enemy to be defeated, but a symbol of the kind of fear-based authority that kept people in subjugation through psychological manipulation rather than legitimate power. His growing understanding of this symbolism convinced him that his destiny lay in confronting and defeating this principle wherever it manifested itself, beginning with his own liberation from the prison that had shaped his development. The decade in solitary confinement that followed represented both punishment for his growing influence and an opportunity for even deeper development of the capabilities that would eventually make him one of the most formidable individuals ever to emerge from Peña Duro's walls. The isolation that was intended to break his spirit instead provided him with uninterrupted time for study, meditation, and physical training that accelerated rather than hindered his transformation from promising young leader into something approaching a force of nature. The cell that became his entire world for those 10 years was barely large enough to contain his growing frame, yet he transformed even this limitation into an advantage by developing exercise routines that required minimal space while providing maximum benefit. Every surface became a tool for physical development. Every hour, an opportunity for mental cultivation. Every challenge, a chance to demonstrate that external circumstances could not determine internal development. The books that continued to reach him through networks that not even solitary confinement could entirely disrupt provided fuel for intellectual growth that proceeded at an accelerated pace during this period of enforced isolation. Without the distractions and demands of social interaction, he could devote his entire attention to the systematic mastery of every field of knowledge that might prove relevant to his eventual emergence as a leader capable of challenging any form of authority. The reputation that he built during these years of isolation paradoxically increased rather than diminished, as stories of his intellectual achievements and physical development spread throughout the prison population, despite his complete separation from direct contact with other inmates. The very fact that he not only survived but apparently thrived under conditions designed to crush the human spirit made him a legendary figure whose eventual return to the general population was awaited with mixture of anticipation and terror. When he finally emerged from solitary confinement after 10 years of isolation, the young man who had entered that cell had been transformed into something that transcended normal categories of human capability. His physical development had proceeded to the point where his strength and endurance exceeded that of men twice his size, while his intellectual mastery encompassed virtually every field of human knowledge that could serve strategic purposes. The reunion with Bird, Zombie, and Trog revealed that their loyalty had not merely survived his absence, but had been strengthened by their recognition that his years in solitary confinement had transformed him from a remarkably gifted young leader into someone whose capabilities bordered on the superhuman. Their own development during his absence had prepared them to serve as more effective instruments of his will, creating a core organization that was ready to implement whatever vision he chose to pursue. The impact of his return upon the general prison population was immediate and profound, as inmates who had heard stories of his legendary status found themselves confronted with someone whose very presence seemed to alter the fundamental dynamics of every situation he entered. His combination of intellectual brilliance, physical prowess, and psychological insight made him irresistible as a leader to those who sought protection and advancement, while simultaneously inspiring terror in those who recognized him as a threat to their own positions within the institutional hierarchy. The consolidation of power that followed his return to the general population proceeded with the systematic efficiency that characterized all his major undertakings, as he methodically identified and neutralized potential sources of opposition while building coalitions that extended his influence throughout every level of the prison's social structure. Within months of his release from solitary confinement, he had established himself as the undisputed master of Peña Duro, a position that he held not through mere intimidation but through demonstration of superior capability in every area that mattered to his followers. Yet even as he achieved complete dominance over his immediate environment, his thoughts were increasingly focused upon the world beyond the prison walls and the greater challenges that awaited someone with his unique combination of capabilities and ambitions. The prophetic dreams that had sustained him through years of isolation now pointed toward a destiny that transcended the narrow confines of Peña Duro, suggesting that his ultimate purpose lay in confronting forces and symbols that operated on a much grander scale than anything his current environment could provide. The warden of Peña Duro had not achieved his position through compassion or administrative excellence, but rather through the kind of ruthless pragmatism that recognized potential threats, long before they could fully manifest themselves into existential challenges to institutional authority. His decades of experience in managing the most dangerous criminals in the Caribbean had taught him to read the subtle signs that distinguished ordinary troublemakers from individuals whose very existence posed fundamental questions about the nature of power and control within carefully structured environments. The reports that reached his office concerning the young man known as Bane carried implications that extended far beyond typical concerns about prison discipline or inmate management, describing instead a figure whose influence had grown to the point where traditional methods of control were not merely inadequate, but potentially counterproductive. The warden understood that direct confrontation with someone who commanded such loyalty and respect among the prison population could easily trigger the kind of widespread unrest that would draw unwanted attention from colonial administrators who preferred their penal institutions to operate with quiet efficiency. Yet the alternative of allowing Bane's power to continue growing unchecked presented equally unacceptable risks to the fundamental order upon which the prison's operations depended, creating a situation where every available option carried the potential for catastrophic consequences that could destroy careers and destabilize the entire regional security apparatus. The warden found himself facing the kind of dilemma that had historically destroyed administrators who lacked the vision and ruthlessness necessary to transform seemingly impossible situations into opportunities for decisive action. The solution that emerged from his consultations with colonial security officials and the small community of researchers who had established laboratories within the prison complex was elegant in its combination of practical, problem-solving and scientific advancement, addressing immediate concerns about institutional control, while also serving broader imperial interests in the development of enhanced human capabilities for military and security applications. The proposal that took shape through these discussions would either eliminate the threat that Bane represented or transform him into something that could serve purposes far more valuable than his destruction. The experimental program that had been conducting research at Peñaduro for several years operated under classifications that placed it beyond the reach of normal oversight mechanisms, funded through channels that ensured complete discretion, while providing access to resources that would have been impossible to obtain through conventional scientific institutions. The researchers involved in this program possessed credentials from the most prestigious universities in Europe and America, yet their work had gradually moved into territories that mainstream academic institutions would never have sanctioned or supported. The focus of their research centered upon the development of pharmaceutical compounds that could enhance human physical and cognitive capabilities beyond normal biological limitations, work that had been inspired by military requirements for soldiers who could operate effectively in environments and circumstances that would overwhelm unenhanced personnel. The theoretical foundations of this research drew upon cutting-edge developments in biochemistry, neurology, and endocrinology, combined with practical insights gained through years of experimentation with various chemical formulations. The substance that had emerged from this research, designated as Venom in the project's classified documentation, represented a breakthrough in the field of human enhancement that surpassed anything previously achieved by researchers working in similar areas. The compound operated by fundamentally altering cellular metabolism and neural function in ways that dramatically increased physical strength, endurance, and reaction time, while also enhancing cognitive capabilities, including memory, processing speed, and pattern recognition. Yet the development of Venom had been marked by a series of catastrophic failures that had claimed the lives of every test subject exposed to the compound, deaths that occurred through mechanisms that the researchers did not fully understand, despite years of intensive study and analysis. The autopsy reports that filled the project's files described subjects who had initially displayed remarkable improvements in all measured capabilities before succumbing to systemic failures that suggested the compound's effects were incompatible with normal human physiology in ways that could not be predicted or prevented through existing medical knowledge. The theoretical models that had guided the compound's development indicated that successful integration required subjects who possessed certain rare genetic markers and physiological characteristics that occurred in fewer than one, indeed 10,000 individuals, creating a population of potential candidates so small that locating suitable test subjects had become the primary obstacle to continued research progress. The prison population of Peñaduro had provided access to a steady stream of subjects for preliminary testing, yet none had possessed the combination of physical resilience and genetic compatibility necessary for survival. The emergence of Bane as a potential test subject represented the convergence of practical necessity and scientific opportunity that transformed a dangerous administrative problem into a chance for breakthrough research that could justify years of investment and experimentation. His exceptional physical development and demonstrated resistance to various forms of stress suggested that he might possess the rare characteristics necessary for successful enhancement, while his problematic status within the prison hierarchy made him an ideal candidate for high-risk experimentation. The preliminary medical examinations conducted without his knowledge or consent revealed physiological parameters that exceeded normal human ranges in virtually every category that had been identified as relevant to venom. Compatibility, suggesting that his unique developmental history had produced exactly the kind of enhanced baseline that the researchers had been seeking. His cardiovascular efficiency, neural conductivity, and metabolic flexibility all fell within ranges that theoretical models indicated would be necessary for surviving the transformation process. The genetic analysis that followed these physical examinations provided even more encouraging results, revealing marker combinations that had never been observed in previous test subjects, while also indicating cellular repair mechanisms that might prove capable of managing the systematic damage that had killed earlier candidates. The researchers found themselves confronting the possibility that they had finally located an individual whose biological systems were naturally adapted for enhancement in ways that made successful transformation not merely possible but likely. The decision to proceed with Bane's selection as a test subject was presented to him not as a choice, but as an inevitable consequence of his disruptive influence within the prison system, a punishment that would either result in his death or his transformation into something that could serve purposes beyond his current existence as a threat to institutional stability. The warden's announcement of this decision was carefully crafted to suggest that resistance would be futile, while also implying that cooperation might lead to outcomes more favorable than simple execution. Yet the man who received this announcement was not the frightened prisoner that the warden had expected to encounter, but rather someone whose years of intellectual development and psychological preparation had equipped him to analyze this situation with the same strategic clarity that he applied to every significant challenge in his life. Bane's response revealed not fear or desperation, but rather fascination with the possibilities that this opportunity might provide, recognition that the enhancement process could transform him into something capable of pursuing objectives that his current limitations made impossible to achieve. The research facility where the transformation would take place had been constructed in the deepest levels of Peñaduro's foundation, carved into living rock and equipped with advanced medical equipment that rivaled anything available in the world's most sophisticated hospitals. The laboratory spaces were designed to contain any possible complications that might arise during the enhancement process, including systems for immediate emergency intervention and facilities for detailed monitoring of every physiological parameter during the critical phases of transformation. The preparation protocol that preceded the actual enhancement process required several days of baseline testing and physical conditioning, designed to optimize his body's readiness for the massive stress that the transformation would impose upon every biological system. These preparatory procedures included dietary modifications to ensure optimal nutritional status, exercise regimens calibrated to his specific physiological profile, and psychological evaluations intended to assess his mental readiness for the profound changes that would accompany successful enhancement. The venom compound itself existed as a complex mixture of synthetic biochemicals that had been refined through hundreds of iterations and thousands of hours of laboratory testing, each component precisely calibrated to interact with specific aspects of human physiology in ways that would amplify natural capabilities while minimizing the risk of catastrophic system failures. The compound's deep green coloration reflected its molecular structure, which incorporated elements that existed nowhere in nature, while mimicking certain aspects of biological processes that govern cellular energy production and neural transmission. The delivery system that had been developed for administering the compound required surgical implantation of specialized tubing that would allow continuous infusion directly into the bloodstream, ensuring optimal distribution throughout the body, while also providing precise control over dosage and timing that had proven crucial in previous experiments. The surgical procedure necessary for this implantation was itself risky, requiring modifications to cardiovascular and nervous system functions that could prove fatal if not executed with perfect precision. The moment of actual transformation began with the initial infusion of venom into his bloodstream, a process that was monitored by dozens of instruments, measuring everything from brain activity to cellular metabolism, as the compound began its work of systematically rewriting the fundamental parameters that governed his biological functions. The changes that followed were both gradual and dramatic, beginning with alterations at the cellular level that rapidly cascaded into system-wide modifications affecting every aspect of his physical and cognitive capabilities. The first effects were observed in his cardiovascular system, as his heart rate and blood pressure began fluctuating in patterns that the monitoring equipment had never recorded in previous subjects, suggesting that his body was responding to the compound in ways that differed fundamentally from earlier test cases. His brain activity showed similar anomalies, with neural firing patterns that indicated unprecedented levels of cognitive activation, accompanied by the formation of new neural pathways at rates that should have been biologically impossible. The physical changes that accompanied these internal transformations were equally dramatic, as his muscle mass began increasing at rates that exceeded normal human development by orders of magnitude, while his bone density and connective tissue strength underwent parallel enhancements that maintained structural integrity despite the massive forces being generated within his body. His skin took on a slightly different texture and coloration, reflecting underlying changes in cellular structure that made him more resistant to various forms of physical damage. Yet perhaps the most remarkable aspect of his transformation was the enhancement of cognitive capabilities that accompanied these physical changes, as his already exceptional intelligence was amplified to levels that allowed him to process information and analyze complex situations with speed and accuracy that bordered on superhuman. His memory became essentially perfect, capable of retaining and retrieving vast amounts of information with precision that made him a living repository of every piece of knowledge he had ever encountered. The sensory enhancements that resulted from the transformation were equally profound, as his visual acuity increased to the point where he could perceive details that would be invisible to normal human vision, while his hearing became sensitive enough to detect sounds that existed at the very edge of human auditory range. These improvements in sensory capability combined with his enhanced cognitive processing to create a level of environmental awareness that made him almost impossible to surprise or deceive. The emotional and psychological effects of the transformation were more complex and difficult to quantify, as the biochemical changes that had enhanced his physical and cognitive capabilities also affected the neural systems that governed mood, motivation, and personality. The compound seemed to amplify certain aspects of his character while dampening others, intensifying his natural tendencies towards strategic thinking and goal-directed behavior, while reducing emotional responses that might interfere with rational decision-making. The integration process that followed the initial transformation required several weeks of careful monitoring and adjustment as his body adapted to its new capabilities and learned to manage the unprecedented levels of energy and information processing that the enhancement made possible. During this period, he remained in the research facility under constant observation, undergoing daily testing to ensure that the changes were stabilizing rather than continuing to escalate in ways that might prove harmful. The researchers who monitored his progress found themselves documenting the first successful human enhancement in the program's history, recording capabilities that exceeded their most optimistic projections, while also revealing aspects of the transformation process that had not been anticipated by their theoretical models. His case became the foundation for an entirely new understanding of human enhancement possibilities, suggesting that the right candidate could not merely survive the process, but emerge from it fundamentally superior to baseline human capabilities. The psychological testing conducted during his recovery period revealed that his intellectual enhancement had proceeded along multiple dimensions simultaneously, with improvements in logical reasoning, creative problem solving, strategic planning, and intuitive insight that made him capable of operating at levels that few unenhanced humans could match, even in their areas of greatest expertise. His ability to rapidly acquire and master new skills had been so dramatically enhanced that he could achieve expertise in complex subjects within timeframes that would normally require months or years of intensive study. The moment when he was finally declared ready to leave the research facility and return to the general prison population marked not just the completion of a successful experiment, but the emergence of something unprecedented in human boss lives. History, an individual whose capabilities transcended normal limitations while retaining the essential characteristics that made him fundamentally human rather than merely an artificial creation. The researchers who had monitored his transformation understood that they had witnessed something that would change their understanding of human potential in ways that would influence scientific development for generations to come. Yet the implications of his transformation extended far beyond scientific advancement to encompass questions about power, responsibility, and the future of human evolution that would shape every decision he made in the years to come. The enhancement that had been imposed upon him as a form of punishment had instead become the foundation for capabilities that made him potentially the most dangerous individual alive. Someone whose combination of intelligence, strength, and ruthless pragmatism could reshape the world according to his vision of what it should become. The return to his cell that night marked the beginning of a new phase in his existence. As he lay in the darkness, contemplating the magnitude of the changes that had been wrought within his body and mind, while also beginning to formulate plans for how these new capabilities could be employed in pursuit of objectives that had previously been impossible to achieve. The prophetic dreams that had sustained him through years of imprisonment now took on new significance as he realized that the power to fulfill them might finally be within his grasp. The compound that flowed through his veins carried with it not merely enhanced physical capabilities, but also the potential for addiction and dependency that the researchers had documented in their theoretical studies, but had never observed in a surviving subject. The psychological relationship that developed between him and the enhancement system became a complex negotiation between his desire for the power it provided and his recognition that complete dependence upon any external factor represented a form of weakness that could ultimately prove fatal. The other inmates who encountered him following his transformation immediately recognized that something fundamental had changed. Though few possessed the knowledge or analytical capability necessary to understand the full implications of what they observed, his physical presence had become more imposing, his intellectual discourse more penetrating, and his strategic insights more profound. Yet these changes were accompanied by an aura of controlled danger that made even his closest allies approach him with new levels of caution and respect. The prison guards, who had previously viewed him as a manageable threat despite his influence and intelligence, found themselves confronting someone whose very presence seemed to alter the fundamental dynamics of every situation, creating an atmosphere of tension and anticipation that suggested the institutional balance of power had shifted in ways that traditional security measures would be inadequate to address. The warden's gamble had succeeded in transforming a problematic inmate, but the result was something far more dangerous than anything the prison had previously contained. The weeks that followed his transformation were marked by careful observation and systematic testing of his new capabilities, as he learned to manage and direct the unprecedented levels of power that now flowed through his enhanced systems. Every aspect of his daily routine became an opportunity to explore the boundaries of what was now possible, from physical exercises that would have been impossible for any unenhanced human to intellectual challenges that revealed the true scope of his cognitive enhancement. The realization that dawned upon him during this period of exploration and adaptation was both liberating and terrifying, as he came to understand that the limitations that had previously constrained his ambitions no longer existed in any meaningful sense. The walls of Peñadoro, which had defined the boundaries of his world for his entire conscious existence, now represented merely the first obstacle to be overcome in pursuit of objectives that encompassed nothing less than the reshaping of human civilization, according to principles that his enhanced intellect was only beginning to formulate. The plan that began to take shape in his mind during those quiet hours of contemplation was audacious in scope and elegant in execution, combining elements of strategic deception, tactical violence, and psychological manipulation in ways that would maximize his advantages, while minimizing the risks inherent in challenging institutional authority that possessed vastly superior resources. The enhancement that had been intended to eliminate him as a threat had instead provided him with the tools necessary to transform himself from prisoner to predator, from victim to victor, in the eternal struggle between individual will and collective power. The final phase of his preparation for escape began with the systematic elimination of potential witnesses and obstacles, carried out with such precision and efficiency that the prison authorities initially interpreted the deaths as unrelated incidents rather than components of a coordinated campaign. His enhanced capabilities made these operations almost effortless, while his strategic intelligence ensured that each action contributed to broader objectives while maintaining plausible deniability. The night when he finally emerged from his cell to claim his freedom was marked by displays of power that shocked even those who had witnessed his transformation, as he methodically dismantled every barrier between himself and liberty, while leaving behind him a trail of destruction that would serve as permanent testament to the futility of attempting to contain forces that operated beyond normal human limitations. The warden who had ordered his enhancement died, knowing that his attempt to eliminate a threat had instead created something infinitely more dangerous, a monster of his own making that would soon unleash itself upon an unprepared world. The helicopter that carried Bane and his loyal companions away from the burning wreckage of Peñaduro cut through Caribbean skies that had not witnessed such a dramatic escape in the decades since the prison's establishment, its rotors beating a rhythm of liberation that echoed across waters where countless dreams of freedom had died beneath the weight of institutional oppression and systematic brutalization. The aircraft itself had been commandeered through methods that demonstrated the enhanced capabilities now at his disposal, acquired not through careful planning or external assistance, but through the kind of direct action that his transformation had made possible for the first time in his existence. Bird, seated beside him as they flew toward their uncertain future, possessed knowledge of the wider world that would prove invaluable in navigating the complexities of life beyond prison walls. Yet even his extensive experience could not have prepared him for the magnitude of change that his enhanced companion now represented. The man he had known as a brilliant but ultimately constrained prisoner had been transformed into something that transcended normal categories of human capability, whose very presence seemed to alter the fundamental dynamics of every situation through the sheer force of enhanced will and expanded possibility. The destination toward which they flew was not chosen randomly, but represented the culmination of years of study and analysis that had identified Gotham City as the optimal testing ground for capabilities that required challenges worthy of their unprecedented scope and sophistication. Bird's detailed knowledge of his American homeland had provided intelligence about urban environments where someone with Bane's unique combination of abilities could establish operations while also pursuing objectives that would demonstrate the full implications of his transformation. Gotham City itself existed as a nexus of corruption and violence that had defied every attempt at reform or rehabilitation, a metropolis where traditional law enforcement had proven inadequate to address the systemic problems that plagued every level of society, from the desperate poverty of its slums to the elegant corruption of its boardrooms. The city's reputation as a haven for criminals and outcasts made it an ideal location for someone whose own legal status remained problematic despite his dramatic escape from official custody. Yet what truly drew Bane's attention to this particular destination was not its convenience as a refuge for those who operated outside conventional legal frameworks, but rather the presence of a figure whose reputation had reached even the isolated confines of Peñaduro through the network of information that connected criminal organizations across the Western Hemisphere. The Batman represented something unprecedented in his experience, a symbol whose power derived not from institutional authority or inherited position, but from the kind of individual will and strategic vision that his own development had taught him to recognize and respect. The intelligence that Bird had gathered about this mysterious protector revealed patterns of operation and tactical methodology that suggested capabilities far beyond those of normal law enforcement officers or even the most skilled private security operatives. Yet these capabilities appeared to be constrained by moral limitations that prevented their wielder from employing the kind of decisive violence that would permanently solve the problems he repeatedly addressed. This apparent weakness created opportunities for someone who possessed both the intelligence to understand Batman's methods and the ruthlessness to exploit their inherent limitations. The deeper significance of Batman's existence lay not in his individual actions or achievements, but in what he represented as a symbol of fear-based authority that maintained order through psychological manipulation rather than legitimate power, making him a perfect embodiment of the demonic bat creature that had haunted Bane's dreams throughout his development. The prophetic visions that had sustained him through years of imprisonment finally revealed their true meaning in the context of this approaching confrontation, suggesting that his entire existence had been preparation for this ultimate test of his capabilities and purpose. The systematic analysis that Bane conducted during his initial weeks in Gotham revealed a city whose complex social and economic structures created numerous opportunities for someone with his combination of intelligence, resources, and enhanced capabilities to establish operations while studying his primary target. The network of criminal organizations that controlled various aspects of illegal commerce provided potential allies and information sources, while the endemic corruption that characterized official institutions ensured that law enforcement attention could be misdirected or avoided through appropriate applications of influence and intimidation. His first priority upon arrival was the establishment of secure facilities that could serve as bases of operation, while also providing the specialized equipment necessary for maintaining his enhancement systems and planning complex operations against sophisticated opponents. The abandoned industrial facilities that dotted Gotham's decaying waterfront offered ideal locations for these purposes, large enough to accommodate his needs, while sufficiently isolated to ensure privacy and security during critical phases of preparation. The recruitment of local personnel to supplement his core team required careful evaluation of candidates who could provide specific capabilities while also meeting standards of loyalty and competence that his previous experience had taught him to consider essential for any successful organization. The criminal underworld of Gotham provided access to individuals with specialized skills in areas ranging from electronics and communications to transportation and weapons procurement. Yet each potential recruit required thorough vetting to ensure reliability under pressure. The intelligence gathering operation that he implemented to study Batman's methods and capabilities represented perhaps the most sophisticated surveillance effort ever directed against a single individual, combining traditional techniques of observation and analysis with technological resources that few law enforcement agencies could match. The goal was not merely to identify weaknesses that could be exploited in direct confrontation, but to understand the psychological and strategic principles that governed Batman's decision-making process in various types of situations. The pattern analysis that emerged from months of careful observation revealed a figure whose tactical brilliance was matched by adherence to moral constraints that created predictable vulnerabilities in his operational methodology, limitations that someone with sufficient intelligence and ruthlessness could exploit to achieve objectives that direct confrontation would make impossible. Batman's unwillingness to employ lethal force, his commitment to protecting innocent bystanders regardless of strategic cost, and his tendency to operate alone rather than with reliable support, all represented potential leverage points for a sufficiently sophisticated adversary. Yet the same analysis that revealed these apparent weaknesses also demonstrated capabilities that demanded profound respect and careful planning to overcome, as Batman's combination of physical prowess, technological resources, and strategic intelligence made him formidable, even when constrained by self-imposed limitations. His knowledge of Gotham's geography and criminal networks provided him with advantages that would be difficult for any outsider to match, while his established relationships with both official law enforcement and unofficial allies created support systems that could complicate any operation directed against him. The psychological profile that gradually took shape through extended observation suggested an individual whose motivation derived from traumatic experiences that had shaped his worldview in ways that made him both predictable and dangerous. Someone whose commitment to his chosen mission transcended rational self-interest to encompass the kind of absolute dedication that could inspire either extraordinary heroism or catastrophic self-destruction. Understanding these motivations became crucial to developing strategies that could exploit them without triggering responses that might prove counterproductive to broader objectives. The most significant insight that emerged from this extended study was the recognition that Batman's greatest strength and most exploitable weakness were fundamentally the same characteristic: his unwavering commitment to protecting innocent life regardless of personal cost or strategic disadvantage. This moral absolute created opportunities for manipulation and tactical exploitation that a sufficiently ruthless opponent could use to force him into situations where every available choice led to outcomes that served his enemies' purposes rather than his own. The development of operational plans based on these insights required careful consideration of timing and sequence, as the strategy that Bane formulated depended upon systematically degrading Batman's physical and psychological resources through a campaign of attrition that would culminate in direct confrontation only after his opponent had been weakened to the point where victory would be assured. This approach reflected lessons learned from his study of military history and strategic theory, applied to the unique circumstances of urban warfare against an opponent who possessed capabilities that exceeded normal human limitations. The decision to avoid immediate direct confrontation, despite his confidence in his enhanced abilities, demonstrated the kind of strategic patience that separated great tacticians from merely competent ones. Recognition that premature engagement could provide his opponent with information and experience that might prove crucial in subsequent encounters. The enhancement that had transformed his capabilities also intensified his appreciation for the importance of preparation and planning in achieving objectives that transcended immediate tactical victories. The preliminary operations that he conducted to test Gotham's security systems and law enforcement responses provided valuable intelligence about the city's defensive capabilities, while also allowing him to evaluate the accuracy of his analysis regarding Batman's operational methods and psychological profile. These initial probes were designed to appear random rather than coordinated, preventing his opponent from recognizing the systematic nature of the intelligence-gathering effort, while also avoiding premature revelation of his presence and capabilities. The criminal activities that he orchestrated during this period served multiple purposes, beyond simple resource acquisition and capability testing, as they also allowed him to study Batman's response patterns in various types of situations while establishing his reputation within Gotham's underworld as someone whose combination of intelligence and ruthlessness made him worthy of respect and potentially valuable as an ally. The careful balance between demonstrating capability and maintaining operational security required constant adjustment based on intelligence feedback and strategic assessment. The psychological warfare component of his preparation involved the systematic cultivation of an atmosphere of tension and anticipation that would gradually erode Batman's confidence and decision-making capability through the accumulation of stress and uncertainty. The methods he employed for this purpose were subtle rather than dramatic, designed to create the impression of an approaching threat whose nature and timing remained unknown, forcing his opponent to maintain heightened alertness that would gradually exhaust his psychological and physical resources. The most brilliant aspect of this preparatory campaign was the way it exploited Batman's own protective instincts against him, creating situations where his commitment to preventing harm to innocent people forced him to expend energy and resources on problems that served his enemy's strategic objectives rather than his own. Each incident was carefully crafted to appear genuine while actually serving as components of a larger pattern designed to manipulate Batman's responses in ways that would gradually degrade his capabilities. The network of informants and allies that Bane developed within Gotham's criminal community provided him with real-time intelligence about law enforcement activities and Batman's movements, while also creating opportunities to influence events in ways that would serve his strategic objectives. These relationships required careful management to ensure loyalty without creating dependencies that might compromise operational security or strategic flexibility. The technological resources that he acquired and deployed during this period represented some of the most advanced equipment available outside of major government or corporate research facilities, obtained through methods that demonstrated his enhanced capabilities, while also providing tools necessary for operations against opponents who possessed access to similarly sophisticated technology. The integration of these resources with his enhanced abilities created multiplicative rather than merely additive improvements in his operational effectiveness. The training regimen that he maintained throughout this preparatory period was designed not merely to preserve the physical and cognitive enhancements that had been achieved through his transformation, but to continue developing them in the preserve the physical, ways that would maximize their effectiveness in the specific types of combat and problem solving that confrontation with Batman would require. Every aspect of his preparation was calibrated to the unique challenges that his analysis had identified as central to achieving victory against this particular opponent. The intelligence reports that reached him through various channels confirmed that his activities were beginning to attract Batman's attention in ways that suggested the success of his psychological warfare campaign, as the Dark Knight's patrol patterns and investigative priorities shifted to reflect growing concern about the coordinated nature of apparently random criminal activities. This recognition marked the transition from purely preparatory operations to the opening phases of direct engagement, though still conducted according to strategic principles that prioritize systematic advantage over dramatic confrontation. The moment when Bane finally decided that his preparation was complete and direct action could commence was determined not by impatience or external pressure, but by careful analysis indicating that the optimal balance between readiness and opportunity had been achieved. His opponent had been sufficiently weakened through months of systematic pressure. His own capabilities had been honed to maximum effectiveness, and circumstances had aligned to provide the tactical advantages necessary for assured success. The strategy that would govern the final phase of his campaign represented the synthesis of everything he had learned about Batman's capabilities and limitations, combined with innovative applications of his own enhanced abilities and acquired resources in ways that would maximize the probability of decisive victory while minimizing risks that could lead to failure or compromise. The plan that emerged from this analysis was elegant in its simplicity yet sophisticated in its execution, designed to exploit every identified weakness while neutralizing every known strength. The masterstroke that would initiate this final campaign involved the systematic release of Batman's most dangerous enemies from Arkham Asylum, an operation that would achieve multiple strategic objectives simultaneously, while also serving as the opening move in a chess game whose conclusion had been predetermined through months of careful analysis and preparation. The chaos that would result from this mass escape would force Batman into exactly the kind of prolonged, exhausting campaign that would leave him vulnerable to the carefully timed final confrontation that would determine the ultimate outcome of their conflict. The beauty of this strategy lay in how it used Batman's own moral principles and protective instincts as weapons against him, forcing him to engage in exactly the kind of resource-depleting operations that would maximize the effectiveness of enhanced capabilities, while minimizing the advantages that experience and local knowledge normally provided. Every aspect of the plan reflected deep understanding of both his opponent's psychology and the operational environment in which their confrontation would unfold. The execution of this strategy would require precise timing and flawless coordination between multiple moving parts, yet Bane's enhanced cognitive abilities made such complex operations manageable in ways that would have been impossible for any unenhanced individual, regardless of their natural intelligence or training. The transformation that had been intended to eliminate him as a threat had instead provided him with exactly the capabilities necessary to achieve objectives that transcended anything he could have accomplished through conventional means. The anticipation that filled him as he prepared to initiate this carefully crafted campaign was not the excitement of someone approaching a gamble whose outcome remained uncertain, but rather the satisfaction of a master strategist who had methodically arranged every element necessary for inevitable victory. The man who had been born in prison and forged by suffering was finally ready to claim his destiny as the one who would break the bat and demonstrate that even the most powerful symbols could be shattered by sufficient will and superior intelligence applied with ruthless precision and perfect timing. The explosion that tore through the reinforced walls of Arkham Asylum on that fateful October night was not the result of some catastrophic accident or structural failure, but rather the first move in a carefully orchestrated campaign that had been planned with the precision of a military operation and the psychological insight of a master strategist who understood that the most effective weapons against his chosen opponent would be fashioned from the very principles that gave Batman his strength. The charges that Bane had placed throughout the facility's foundations were calibrated not merely to breach containment, but to create specific patterns of destruction that would maximize chaos while ensuring the survival of particular inmates whose individual capabilities would serve his broader strategic objectives. The timing of the explosion had been calculated to occur during the shift change that offered the greatest probability of minimizing casualties among the facility's staff, while maximizing the confusion that would delay coordinated response efforts, reflecting Bane's understanding that unnecessary deaths would only complicate his plans by triggering responses from law enforcement agencies whose involvement could interfere with the carefully controlled confrontation he sought to orchestrate. His enhanced intellect allowed him to process multiple variables simultaneously, creating tactical solutions that achieved his objectives while maintaining the moral high ground that would be necessary for the psychological warfare components of his strategy. The selection of prisoners whose release would serve his purposes had been based upon months of detailed analysis of their individual capabilities, psychological profiles, and historical relationships with Batman, identifying those whose freedom would create the specific types of challenges that would force the Dark Knight into the kind of prolonged, exhausting campaign that would systematically degrade his physical and mental resources. Each escapee represented not merely a threat to be contained, but a component in a larger machine designed to grind down Batman's legendary endurance through the accumulation of stress and exhaustion. The Joker's release from his maximum security cell was perhaps the most crucial element in this carefully crafted chaos, as his unpredictable nature and obsessive fixation upon Batman made him an ideal instrument for creating the kind of psychological pressure that would force hasty decisions and tactical errors. The Clown Prince of Crime's genius for turning order into chaos served Bane's purposes perfectly, yet his very unpredictability required careful management to ensure that his activities remained aligned with broader strategic objectives rather than spiraling into random destruction that might interfere with more important operations. The liberation of Two-Face added another layer of complexity to the challenges that Batman would be forced to address, as Harvey Dent's dual nature and intimate knowledge of Gotham's legal and political systems made him capable of orchestrating crimes that operated at the intersection of legal and illegal activities, forcing Batman to navigate moral ambiguities that would slow his response times and create additional psychological stress. The former district attorney's transformation into a criminal mastermind represented exactly the kind of personal tragedy that would resonate with Batman's own psychological vulnerabilities. The Scarecrow's expertise in fear-based psychological warfare made him invaluable for creating the atmosphere of terror and uncertainty that would gradually erode the confidence and resolve of both Batman and the general population, while his understanding of neurochemistry and psychological manipulation provided tools that could be used to amplify the effectiveness of other operations. The Master of Fear's ability to weaponize the deepest anxieties and phobias of his victims created opportunities for tactical advantages that conventional criminal methods could never achieve. The Mad Hatter's skills in technological manipulation and mind control offered possibilities for operations that could compromise Batman's support systems and information networks, potentially turning his own resources against him in ways that would maximize confusion while minimizing the visibility of external interference. The deranged inventor's obsession with Lewis Carroll's literary works masked a brilliant intellect capable of creating technological solutions to complex strategic problems. The release of lesser-known but equally dangerous inmates like Victor Zsasz, Firefly, and the ventriloquist added numerical complexity to the situation, while also providing specialists whose particular skills could be deployed in support of more significant operations, creating a network of criminal activity that would strain Gotham's law enforcement resources beyond their capacity to respond effectively. Each represented a thread in a tapestry of chaos that would gradually tighten around Batman like a noose constructed from his own moral obligations. The immediate aftermath of the mass breakout created exactly the kind of citywide crisis that Bane's analysis had predicted. As news reports of the escape triggered panic among Gotham's civilian population, while simultaneously overwhelming police communication systems with emergency calls that far exceeded the department's capacity to investigate and respond. The psychological impact of knowing that the city's most dangerous criminals were loose created an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty that would persist long after the immediate crisis had been resolved. Batman's response to this manufactured catastrophe unfolded precisely according to the patterns that months of observation had established, as he immediately prioritized the recapture of the most dangerous escapees while attempting to minimize harm to innocent bystanders caught in the crossfire of criminal activities that erupted across the city, like fires started by a deliberately systematic arsonist. His methodical approach to addressing each threat in order of priority created opportunities for tactical manipulation that a less systematic opponent would never have been able to exploit. The systematic campaign that followed tested every aspect of Batman's legendary capabilities as he found himself engaged in a city-wide manhunt that required him to operate at maximum capacity for extended periods without adequate rest or recovery time between encounters. Each recaptured criminal represented a tactical victory that came at the cost of physical exhaustion and psychological stress that accumulated like compound interest, gradually eroding the reserves of strength and mental clarity that his effectiveness depended upon. The Joker's campaign of random terror was designed to be impossible to predict or prevent through conventional methods, forcing Batman to respond reactively to crimes that had already occurred rather than intercepting them before they could cause harm, a tactical disadvantage that violated his preferred operational methodology and created additional psychological pressure. The Clown Prince's attacks on seemingly random targets made it impossible to establish protective cordons or predictive patterns that might have allowed more efficient resource allocation. The confrontation with Two-Face required Batman to navigate complex legal and ethical questions that had no clear answers while operating under extreme time pressure that prevented the kind of careful analysis that such situations normally demanded, creating opportunities for mistakes and oversights that would compound over time. The former district attorney's intimate knowledge of Batman's psychological profile made him particularly effective at creating no-win scenarios that would generate additional stress regardless of their ultimate Resolution. The encounter with Scarecrow exposed Batman to concentrated doses of fear toxin that, while not permanently debilitating, created cumulative effects that would influence his decision-making capabilities in subsequent operations through the introduction of subliminal anxieties and phobias that operated below the threshold of conscious awareness. The Master of Fear's understanding of neurochemistry allowed him to craft psychological weapons that would continue affecting their targets long after the immediate confrontation had ended. Each successive capture required increasingly desperate tactics and greater personal risk, as Batman's physical and mental resources were systematically depleted through the accumulation of minor injuries, sleep deprivation, and psychological stress that gradually reduced his operational effectiveness despite his legendary determination and training. The mathematical progression of exhaustion that resulted from this campaign proceeded according to calculations that Bane had performed months in advance, confirming the accuracy of his strategic analysis. The media coverage that accompanied this unprecedented crime wave created additional pressure through the formation of public expectations that Batman would quickly restore order to the city, expectations that became increasingly difficult to meet as his effectiveness declined and the complexity of the criminal activities he was forced to address continued to escalate. The psychological burden of public responsibility added another layer of stress to an already overwhelming situation. The 3 months that this campaign continued represented a period of sustained combat operations that would have broken most individuals regardless of their training or natural capabilities. Yet Batman's legendary endurance allowed him to continue functioning at levels that amazed even those who had studied his capabilities most closely. His eventual success in recapturing all of the escaped inmates represented a triumph of will over circumstance that validated his reputation as one of the most formidable individuals alive. Yet this victory came at a cost that was invisible to outside observers, but clearly evident to anyone who possessed the analytical capabilities necessary to recognize the subtle signs of accumulated damage that no amount of determination could completely overcome. Batman's movements had become slightly less fluid, his reaction times marginally slower, his decision-making processes fractionally less precise. Changes that would be undetectable to most opponents, but represented significant tactical advantages for someone with Bane's enhanced perceptive abilities. The timing of Bane's personal intervention was calculated to occur at the precise moment when Batman's degraded capabilities would be offset by his sense of accomplishment at having successfully resolved the crisis, creating a psychological state that combined confidence with exhaustion in ways that would maximize his vulnerability to the kind of direct confrontation that Bane had been preparing for throughout the entire campaign. The approach to Wayne Manor was conducted with the stealth capabilities that his enhancement had made possible, allowing him to penetrate security systems that should have detected any unauthorized presence. The confrontation that unfolded in the study of Wayne Manor was not a battle between equals, but rather the culmination of a strategic campaign that had systematically eliminated every advantage that Batman might have possessed under normal circumstances, leaving him to face an opponent whose capabilities exceeded his own at a moment when his own resources had been reduced to their minimum sustainable levels. The symbolic significance of this location, representing the private sanctuary where Bruce Wayne could retreat from his public persona as Batman, added psychological dimensions to the encounter that transcended mere physical combat. Bane's analysis of Batman's fighting style during their initial exchange confirmed the accuracy of his assessments regarding the degradation of his opponent's capabilities, as movements that should have been swift and precise instead carried the subtle hesitations and miscalculations that characterized combat performance under conditions of extreme exhaustion. The enhanced sensory capabilities that his transformation had provided allowed him to detect and exploit these minute deficiencies in ways that gradually shifted the balance of the encounter in his favor. The psychological warfare that Bane employed during their combat involved systematic attacks upon the beliefs and assumptions that formed the foundation of Batman's heroic identity, questioning the effectiveness of his methods and the wisdom of his moral constraints, while demonstrating through physical dominance that superior intelligence and preparation could overcome any combination of training and determination. These verbal assaults were designed to create cognitive dissonance that would interfere with Batman's ability to maintain focus during the crucial phases of their encounter. The revelation of Bane's knowledge regarding Batman's secret identity represented the deployment of intelligence that had been gathered through months of careful observation and analysis. Information that transformed their confrontation from a simple physical contest into something far more personal and threatening. The implications of this knowledge extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation to encompass threats against everyone associated with Bruce Wayne's civilian life, creating psychological leverage that no amount of physical prowess could counter. The systematic dismantling of Batman's defensive strategies proceeded according to tactical principles that Bane had derived from his extensive study of military history and combat theory, applied with the precision that his enhanced cognitive abilities made possible, and executed with the physical capabilities that his transformation had provided. Every technique that Batman employed was countered with responses that demonstrated superior preparation and deeper understanding of combat dynamics. The accumulation of damage that Batman sustained throughout their extended battle reflected not merely the immediate effects of physical trauma, but also the gradual breakdown of defensive systems that had been compromised by months of accumulated exhaustion and stress, creating cascading failures that made each successive exchange more difficult to survive. The legendary resilience that had allowed him to overcome countless previous challenges was finally encountering forces that exceeded its capacity for compensation and adaptation. The moment when Bane lifted Batman above his head and brought his spine down across his knee represented not merely the infliction of physical injury, but the symbolic breaking of something far more significant than bone and flesh, the destruction of the myth of invincibility that had sustained both Batman's effectiveness and the hope of those who looked to him for protection. The sound that echoed through Wayne Manor was the snapping of more than just vertebrae, but the fracture of certainty that had defined an entire era of heroic resistance against the forces of chaos and evil. The paralysis that resulted from this catastrophic injury was both immediate and comprehensive, transforming one of the world's most formidable individuals into someone who could not even rise from the floor upon which he had fallen, a transformation that demonstrated the ultimate fragility of human capability regardless of training, resources, or determination. The medical reality of spinal cord injury imposed limitations that no amount of willpower could overcome, creating a situation where psychological strength became irrelevant in the face of physiological impossibility. Bane's decision to leave his defeated opponent alive, rather than administering a killing blow, reflected strategic calculations that extended beyond immediate tactical considerations to encompass broader psychological and symbolic objectives. Recognition that Batman's continued existence in a helpless state would serve his purposes more effectively than martyrdom could achieve. The living symbol of defeat would provide more powerful demonstration of his superiority than any corpse could accomplish, while also maintaining options for future manipulation and exploitation. The emergence of Jean-Paul Valley as Batman's replacement represented exactly the kind of development that Bane's strategic analysis had anticipated, though the specific characteristics of this new adversary introduced variables that would require careful study and tactical adaptation. The transition from Bruce Wayne's disciplined and morally constrained approach to crime fighting to Azrael's more aggressive and technologically enhanced methodology created new challenges that would test different aspects of his capabilities. The psychological profile that emerged from initial encounters with this new Batman revealed someone whose mental conditioning and technological resources created combat capabilities that differed fundamentally from those of his predecessor, requiring modifications to tactical approaches that had proven effective against the original Dark Knight. The armor system that Azrael employed provided enhanced physical protection, while also incorporating weapons and capabilities that expanded the range of tactical options available to him during combat operations. The strategic patience that Bane demonstrated in studying this new opponent before engaging in serious confrontation reflected lessons learned from his analysis of Batman's methods, recognition that premature engagement could provide his enemy with information and experience that might prove crucial in subsequent encounters. The transformation that had enhanced his capabilities had also intensified his appreciation for the importance of preparation and planning in achieving objectives that transcended immediate tactical victories. The confrontation that finally occurred between Bane and Azrael represented the collision of two very different approaches to enhanced human capability, as Bane's chemically and physically augmented biology encountered Valley's technologically mediated improvements in a battle that tested the relative effectiveness of different paths to transcendence of normal human limitations. The outcome of this encounter would provide valuable data regarding the comparative advantages of various enhancement methodologies. The tactical approach that Azrael employed during their battle reflected his different training and psychological conditioning, emphasizing aggressive assault and technological superiority over the defensive strategies and moral constraints that had characterized his predecessor's methodology. This shift in approach created opportunities for tactical adaptation, while also eliminating certain forms of psychological leverage that had proven effective in previous encounters. The severing of Bane's venom supply lines during the climax of their battle represented a tactical innovation that exploited the one significant vulnerability in his enhancement system, demonstrating that superior intelligence and preparation could sometimes overcome even the most sophisticated technological advantages. The immediate effects of this tactical success created opportunities for decisive action that Valley was able to exploit, despite his opponent's superior physical capabilities. The withdrawal symptoms that resulted from the sudden cessation of venom enhancement were both immediate and catastrophic, transforming Bane from an enhanced superhuman into something significantly weaker than baseline human capability within minutes of the tactical reversal that had severed his connection to the compound that sustained his extraordinary abilities. The psychological shock of this transformation was perhaps more devastating than the physical effects. As someone who had grown accustomed to godlike capabilities, found himself reduced to helpless vulnerability. The defeat that followed represented not merely a tactical reverse, but a fundamental challenge to the assumptions and beliefs that had sustained Bane throughout his transformation and subsequent campaign against Gotham's Bane protectors, forcing him to confront the possibility that his analysis of power, relationships, and enhancement methodologies contained flaws that had rendered his strategic calculations invalid. The legend of invincibility that he had constructed around his enhanced capabilities was shattered as completely as Batman's spine had been during their previous encounter. Yet, even in defeat, the changes that Bane had wrought upon Gotham's heroic landscape would prove permanent and irreversible, as the breaking of the original Batman had demonstrated vulnerabilities in the mythic structures that protected civilization from the forces of chaos and evil. The knowledge that even the most powerful symbols could be broken by sufficient preparation and superior strategy would influence every subsequent confrontation between enhanced individuals and the institutional structures they challenged. The period of recovery and reflection that followed this defeat would provide Bane with opportunities to analyze the tactical and strategic errors that had led to his downfall, while also exploring alternative approaches to the achievement of objectives that transcended immediate tactical victories, setting the stage for future developments that would demonstrate the resilience and adaptability that had sustained him through previous challenges and transformations. The walls of Blackgate Penitentiary had witnessed countless stories of redemption and recidivism, yet none quite like the transformation that began when Bane was processed through its intake facilities in a state of physical and psychological collapse that bore little resemblance to the enhanced superhuman who had once terrorized Gotham City with displays of power that had seemed to transcend normal human limitations. The withdrawal from Venom that had begun during his final confrontation with Azrael continued to ravage his system with symptoms that combined the worst aspects of drug addiction with the unique complications that arose from dependency upon a compound that had fundamentally altered his cellular structure and neural chemistry. The medical staff who oversaw his initial treatment found themselves confronting a case that challenged every aspect of their professional training and experience, as his body struggled to adapt to the sudden absence of chemical enhancement, while also dealing with the accumulated damage that months of superhuman exertion had inflicted upon systems that were never designed to operate at such extreme levels. The physical symptoms included muscle deterioration, cardiovascular instability, and neurological dysfunction that created cascading health crises requiring constant monitoring and intervention. The psychological dimensions of his withdrawal proved even more challenging to address, as the man who had grown accustomed to enhanced cognitive capabilities that allowed him to process information and analyze complex situations with unprecedented speed and accuracy, found himself reduced to thought processes that seemed sluggish and confused by comparison. The frustration that resulted from this cognitive decline was compounded by depression and anxiety that reflected not merely chemical imbalances, but genuine grief for the loss of capabilities that had defined his identity and purpose. The rehabilitation program that was eventually developed to address his unique circumstances required collaboration between specialists in addiction medicine, neurology, psychology, and biochemistry, creating an interdisciplinary approach that had never been attempted for someone whose enhancement and subsequent withdrawal presented challenges that existed nowhere in medical literature. The theoretical foundations for treating venom dependency were largely extrapolated from research on other performance-enhancing substances, yet the unique properties of the compound that had transformed him required constant innovation and adaptation. The process of physical recovery proceeded through phases that tested his endurance and determination in ways that differed fundamentally from but proved no less challenging than the trials he had faced during his years in Peña Duro. As his body slowly learned to function without chemical augmentation, while simultaneously healing from the damage that superhuman activities had inflicted upon his biological systems, the exercise regimens and physical therapy protocols that guided this recovery required careful calibration to provide adequate challenge without overwhelming systems that were still adapting to their new limitations. The intellectual rehabilitation that accompanied his physical recovery involved relearning how to think and analyze, without the enhanced cognitive capabilities that had become integral to his identity. a process that revealed both the extent to which the chemical enhancement had changed his mental processes and the remarkable baseline intelligence that had existed before his transformation. The books and educational materials that filled his cell during this period served not merely as entertainment but as tools for rebuilding intellectual capabilities that could function effectively within normal human parameters. The philosophical questions that emerged during his recovery went beyond immediate concerns about health and capability to encompass fundamental issues about identity, purpose, and the meaning of existence when stripped of the extraordinary characteristics that had seemed to define his essential nature. The man who had once viewed himself as evolution's answer to human limitation found himself forced to confront the possibility that his true significance might lie in qualities that had nothing to do with chemical enhancement or superhuman capability. The gradual revelation of his true parentage began as a psychological exercise designed to help him reconnect with aspects of his identity that predated his transformation. Yet, it evolved into something far more significant as research into his family history uncovered connections and relationships that placed his entire life story in contexts he had never previously considered. The initial investigation was motivated by therapeutic goals rather than genuine curiosity. Yet the information it revealed challenged fundamental assumptions about his origins and destiny. The process of genealogical research that was conducted with assistance from various institutional resources revealed a complex web of relationships and historical connections that extended far beyond the revolutionary heritage that had shaped his early understanding of his place in the world, suggesting that his story was part of larger patterns of conflict and consequence that spanned generations. The methodical analysis of records, interviews, and DNA evidence gradually constructed a family tree that included branches he had never suspected existed. The identification of potential candidates for his biological father required careful evaluation of evidence that combined historical documentation with genetic analysis and psychological profiling, creating a list of individuals whose involvement with his mother during the relevant time period could account for his existence. The investigation revealed 4 men whose circumstances and characteristics made them plausible candidates, each representing different possibilities for understanding his genetic heritage and inherited traits. The first candidate was a fellow revolutionary whose tactical brilliance and strategic vision had made him one of the most effective leaders in the independence movement, someone whose intellectual capabilities and dedication to the cause of liberation suggested genetic contributions that could account for the exceptional intelligence and tactical acumen that had characterized Bane's development even before his chemical enhancement. The historical records that documented this man's activities revealed patterns of thought and action that seemed to prefigure many of the characteristics that had defined his own approach to complex problems. The second possibility involved a colonial administrator whose complex relationship with the revolutionary cause had placed him in positions where contact with captured revolutionaries would have been both possible and likely. Someone whose background in military strategy and institutional management might have contributed genetic predispositions toward organization and systematic thinking. The moral ambiguities that surrounded this potential father's activities during the revolutionary period created uncomfortable questions about the sources of his own strategic capabilities. The third candidate was a foreign mercenary whose involvement in various Caribbean conflicts had brought him into contact with revolutionary forces during the critical period. Someone whose international experience and military expertise suggested genetic contributions that could account for the tactical sophistication and adaptability that had characterized his own development. The mercenary's reputation for ruthless efficiency and moral flexibility created disturbing parallels with aspects of his own personality that he had never fully examined. The fourth and most surprising possibility was Dr. Thomas Wayne, the respected physician and philanthropist, whose presence in Santa Prisca during a humanitarian mission had coincided with the revolutionary period in ways that made contact with his mother theoretically possible, though highly unlikely given the social and political barriers that would have separated a captured revolutionary from a visiting American doctor. The very notion that he might be connected to the Wayne family created implications that extended far beyond questions of genetic heritage. The collaboration with Batman that developed during the investigation of Venom-related crimes created one of the most complex relationships in his entire experience, as he found himself working alongside someone whose capabilities he respected, while also serving as a constant reminder of his own defeat and the limitations that now constrained his activities. The partnership required careful navigation of psychological and tactical considerations that could easily have led to conflict rather than cooperation. The investigation that brought them together centered upon a series of crimes involving the distribution of venom derivatives that posed significant threats to public safety, while also representing perversions of the compound that had once enhanced his own capabilities, creating personal stakes that transcended professional or civic duty. The criminals who were distributing these substances lacked both the scientific knowledge necessary to refine them safely and the moral constraints that might have limited their harmful effects. The street-level distribution of crude venom compounds was creating addicts whose enhancement was accompanied by severe psychological and physical deterioration that often proved fatal within weeks of initial exposure, demonstrating the dangers that accompanied attempts to replicate the transformation process without proper scientific oversight and medical support. The deaths and injuries that resulted from these amateur enhancement attempts provided stark reminders of how fortunate he had been to survive his own transformation. Batman's approach to investigating these crimes revealed tactical methodologies and analytical frameworks that Bane found himself studying with the same intensity he had once applied to planning the Dark Knight's defeat, though now his motivation involved professional respect rather than adversarial intent. The opportunity to observe Batman's investigative techniques from the perspective of an ally rather than an enemy provided insights into capabilities and limitations that previous encounters had not revealed. The gradual development of mutual respect between former enemies reflected recognition that their shared commitment to stopping the venom distribution network transcended personal history and previous conflicts, creating common ground that made effective cooperation possible, despite the psychological complexities that surrounded their interactions. The working relationship that emerged was characterized by cautious professionalism that gradually evolved into something approaching trust. The breakthrough that led to identification of the criminal organization responsible for the venom distribution came through analysis that combined Batman's investigative resources with Bane's intimate knowledge of the Bane's compound's effects and production requirements, demonstrating the effectiveness of collaboration between individuals whose complementary capabilities could achieve results that neither could accomplish alone. The intelligence that emerged from this joint effort revealed a conspiracy that extended far beyond simple drug trafficking. The criminal network that they uncovered was led by individuals whose scientific knowledge and technological resources made them capable of producing venom derivatives that approached the quality of the original compound while avoiding the venom beers to that love and technology. Many of the safety protocols that had made his own transformation possible, creating substances that were both more addictive and more dangerous than anything that legitimate research had produced. The profit margins involved in this illegal trade provided motivation for continued expansion despite the human cost. The raids that dismantled this network required tactical coordination between Batman's resources and Bane's knowledge of enhanced individual combat capabilities, creating joint operations that tested their ability to function as partners rather than adversaries. The success of these missions demonstrated that former enemies could indeed work together when circumstances created sufficient motivation and mutual respect. The DNA analysis that finally resolved questions about his paternity came through legitimate channels that had been established during the Venom investigation, providing access to genetic databases and analytical capabilities that would otherwise have remained unavailable to someone with his criminal background. The results of these tests eliminated 3 of the 4 candidates while confirming the 4th in ways that provided both clarity and additional complexity. The revelation that Edmund Dorrance, also known as King Snake, was his biological father created immediate questions about genetic predispositions and inherited characteristics, while also establishing connections to criminal organizations and enhancement programs that placed his own story in broader contexts of family legacy and generational conflict. King Snake's reputation as one of the world's most dangerous criminals suggested genetic contributions that could account for many of his own capabilities and tendencies. The meeting that was eventually arranged between father and son took place under circumstances that reflected the complex security and emotional considerations that surrounded any interaction between 2 individuals whose combined capabilities and criminal associations posed significant risks to public safety. The location and protocols that governed this encounter required extensive planning and coordination between multiple law enforcement agencies. The psychological dynamics that emerged during their initial conversations revealed both similarities and differences that reflected the complex interplay between genetic inheritance and environmental influence that had shaped their respective development, creating opportunities for understanding that were accompanied by recognition of fundamental incompatibilities in their worldviews and moral frameworks. The relationship that developed was characterized by mutual respect that coexisted with profound disagreement about methods and objectives. King Snake's approach to criminal enterprise emphasized efficiency and profit maximization in ways that contrasted sharply with the ideological motivations and strategic complexity that had characterized Bane's own activities, revealing differences in temperament and priorities that suggested environmental factors had been at least as important as genetic inheritance in shaping his development. The criminal empire that his father had built was impressive in scope, yet seemed to lack the moral complexity and intellectual sophistication that had defined his own campaigns. The moral evolution that occurred during this period of investigation and family discovery involved gradual recognition that his previous activities, however strategically brilliant and tactically effective, had caused genuine suffering to innocent people whose only crime had been existing within the sphere of his operations. The enhanced empathy and moral sensitivity that developed during his recovery process made it increasingly difficult to rationalize the collateral damage that had accompanied his pursuit of objectives that had seemed so important at the time. The philosophical framework that began to emerge from this moral development emphasized principles of justice and protection that bore striking similarities to the ethical code that governed Batman's activities, though approached from perspectives that reflected his different background and experiences. The possibility of redemption through service to others became increasingly attractive as alternative approaches to finding meaning and purpose in existence that had been stripped of chemical enhancement and superhuman capability. The transition from pure villain to complex anti-hero was neither sudden nor complete, involving gradual shifts in motivation and methodology that reflected ongoing internal struggles between inherited tendencies toward violence and manipulation, and developing commitments to more constructive approaches to problem solving. The conflicts between these different aspects of his nature created psychological tensions that required constant attention and management. The therapeutic process that supported this moral and psychological development involved regular sessions with specialists who possessed both the clinical expertise necessary to address his unique circumstances and the security clearances required to work with someone whose background included activities that remained classified at the highest levels of government. The insights that emerged from this therapy provided frameworks for understanding and managing the complex emotions and motivations that had driven his previous actions. The gradual acceptance of responsibility for past actions was perhaps the most difficult aspect of his rehabilitation, requiring acknowledgement of harm that could never be fully remedied, and victims whose suffering could never be completely undone through subsequent good works or charitable contributions. The weight of this responsibility became a permanent aspect of his psychological landscape, influencing every subsequent decision and relationship. The recognition that redemption was possible but not inevitable created motivation for sustained effort toward moral development and constructive activity that could serve as partial compensation for previous wrongs while also providing meaningful purpose for a life that had been redefined by the loss of chemical enhancement. The understanding that this process would require lifelong commitment rather than dramatic gestures added both realism and determination to his efforts. The relationships that developed with other inmates and staff members during his incarceration reflected his evolving moral framework and growing capacity for genuine human connection that was not based upon manipulation or strategic advantage, creating social bonds that provided both support and accountability in his ongoing development. These relationships served as testing grounds for new approaches to interpersonal interaction that emphasized honesty and mutual respect. The educational and intellectual pursuits that filled his time during recovery involved both formal study through prison programs and independent research into subjects that could support his moral development and provide frameworks for constructive contribution to society following his eventual release. The knowledge that he acquired during this period was directed toward understanding rather than exploitation, reflecting fundamental changes in his approach to information and capability. The physical training regimen that he maintained throughout his recovery was designed not to recreate superhuman capabilities, but to develop strength and fitness that could support legitimate activities, while also providing psychological benefits through discipline and achievement that did not depend upon chemical enhancement. The acceptance of normal human limitations became a crucial component of his overall rehabilitation. The writing project that he began during the final phases of his incarceration involved documenting his experiences and insights in ways that might provide value to others who faced similar challenges with addiction, moral development, and the search for meaning in lives that had been fundamentally altered by extraordinary circumstances. The process of articulating his thoughts and experiences in coherent narrative form became both therapeutic exercise and potential contribution to knowledge that could benefit others. The vessel that carried Bane back toward the shores of Santa Prisca cut through Caribbean waters that had remained unchanged since his childhood. Yet everything else about his return journey differed fundamentally from the desperate escape that had taken him away from his homeland decades earlier. As an enhanced superhuman, fleeing the consequences of his dramatic liberation from Peña, Duro, the man who stood at the ship's bow watching familiar mountains emerge from the morning mist, was neither the chemically augmented destroyer who had broken Batman's spine, nor the broken prisoner who had entered Blackgate Penitentiary in withdrawal and despair, but rather someone who had been fundamentally transformed by experiences that transcended physical enhancement or pharmaceutical dependency. The years of rehabilitation and moral development that had occupied his incarceration had provided time for reflection upon the meaning of power and responsibility that went far beyond the tactical considerations that had once consumed his thoughts, creating philosophical frameworks that emphasized service to others rather than domination over them. The books that had filled his cell during those long months of recovery had included works on political theory, social organization, and ethical leadership that provided intellectual foundations for approaches to governance that differed radically from the authoritarian models that had characterized his previous understanding of effective administration. The correspondence that he had maintained with various individuals during his imprisonment had included exchanges with former revolutionaries who had survived the failed independence movement that had claimed his parents, creating connections to the political heritage that had shaped his early development, while also providing insights into the complex challenges that faced any attempt to create lasting positive change in societies that had been shaped by generations of exploitation and institutional corruption. These conversations had revealed both the possibilities and limitations inherent in revolutionary transformation. The financial resources that had been accumulated through legitimate channels during his incarceration came from intellectual property rights to various innovations and theoretical developments that had emerged from his enhanced cognitive capabilities during the period before his defeat, creating a foundation of wealth that could support ambitious projects without requiring the criminal activities that had previously funded his operations. The transition from illegal to legal sources of funding represented more than mere pragmatic adaptation, but rather fundamental commitment to operating within ethical boundaries. The team of advisors and specialists who had agreed to accompany him on his return to Santa Prisca represented a careful selection of individuals whose expertise in areas ranging from economics and engineering to education and public health could provide the technical knowledge necessary to implement comprehensive social and political reforms. Each member of this group had been chosen not merely for professional competence, but also for demonstrated commitment to principles of justice and human dignity that aligned with his evolved moral framework. The initial reconnaissance that they conducted upon arrival revealed an island that had deteriorated significantly since his departure, as successive governments had proven incapable of addressing the systemic problems that had plagued Santa Prisca for generations, while also introducing new forms of corruption and exploitation that had worsened conditions for the general population. The infrastructure that had been inadequate during his childhood had decayed further through neglect and mismanagement, creating humanitarian crises that demanded immediate attention. The prison facility of Peña Duro itself had been abandoned following a series of scandals and human rights investigations that had exposed the systematic brutality and illegal experimentation that had characterized its operations, leaving behind a fortress of stone and steel that stood as a monument to institutional cruelty and the suffering of countless individuals who had been subjected to its dehumanizing conditions. The empty cells and corridors that had once confined hundreds of prisoners now served as stark reminders of the cycles of violence and retribution that had defined the island's history. The liberation of Peña Duro that Bane orchestrated was conducted not through violent assault, but rather through legal and administrative processes that established legitimate authority over the facility, while also providing resources for its transformation from a symbol of oppression into something that could serve constructive purposes for the island's population. The methodical approach that characterized this operation reflected lessons learned from his previous failures and commitment to sustainable change rather than dramatic gestures. The conversion of the prison complex into a combination educational facility, medical center, and agricultural research station required extensive renovation and reconstruction that provided employment opportunities for local workers, while also demonstrating practical commitment to improving conditions for the island's residents The symbolism of transforming an institution of punishment into one of healing and learning was not lost on a population that had lived with the shadow of Peña Duro throughout their collective memory. The political movement that gradually coalesced around Bane's return was built upon foundations of genuine popular support rather than intimidation or manipulation, as his reputation for intellectual capability and moral development had preceded him through networks of communication that connected Santa Prisca to the broader Caribbean community. The demonstrations and rallies that marked his emergence as a political leader were characterized by enthusiasm and hope rather than the fear and coercion that had marked previous attempts at revolutionary change. The economic development program that formed the centerpiece of his political platform was based upon principles of sustainable growth and equitable distribution that drew upon the most advanced theoretical frameworks in development economics, while also incorporating practical insights gained through analysis of successful and failed development projects throughout the Caribbean and Latin America. The goal was not merely to increase aggregate wealth, but to ensure that economic progress translated into improved living conditions for all segments of the population. The educational reforms that he implemented drew upon his own extraordinary learning experiences to create systems that could nurture intellectual development and critical thinking capabilities in young people who had previously been denied access to quality education through the perpetuation of elite structures that reserved advanced learning for the privileged few. The curriculum that emerged from these reforms emphasized both technical skills necessary for economic development and philosophical frameworks necessary for ethical decision-making. The healthcare initiatives that accompanied these broader reforms addressed both immediate medical needs and long-term public health challenges through the establishment of modern medical facilities and training programs that could produce the healthcare professionals necessary to serve the island's population effectively. The integration of traditional healing practices with modern medical techniques created synthesis approaches that respected cultural heritage while also providing access to the most effective available treatments. The agricultural development projects that transformed large portions of the island's unused land into productive farms and research facilities provided both economic opportunities and food security for a population that had been dependent upon expensive imports for basic nutritional needs. The techniques that were employed in these projects incorporated both traditional knowledge and modern scientific methods to create sustainable production systems that could support the island's population while also contributing to export earnings. The infrastructure investments that accompanied these sectoral reforms included construction of roads, power systems, water treatment facilities, and communication networks that provided the foundation necessary for sustained economic growth, while also improving quality of life for residents who had previously lacked access to basic services that were taken for granted in more developed regions. The financing for these projects came through combination of domestic resources and international partnerships that avoided the debt dependency that had characterized previous development efforts. The initial success of these comprehensive reforms created momentum that attracted international attention and investment, while also inspiring confidence among the island's residents that genuine positive change was possible through sustained effort and intelligent planning, rather than revolutionary violence or authoritarian control. The transformation that occurred during the first years of his leadership validated the philosophical principles that had guided his approach, while also demonstrating practical effectiveness of comprehensive reform strategies. The democratic institutions that he established were designed to ensure that political power remained distributed rather than concentrated in ways that could lead to the authoritarian abuses that had characterized previous governments. creating systems of checks and balances that would prevent any individual or group from accumulating excessive influence over governmental decision-making processes. The constitutional framework that emerged from these efforts drew upon the most successful examples of democratic governance, while also incorporating innovations designed to address the specific challenges that face small island, developing states. The civil liberties, protections that were embedded in these new governmental structures reflected his personal understanding of the importance of individual rights and freedoms that had been denied to him throughout his early development, creating legal frameworks that would prevent the kind of systematic oppression and abuse that had characterized the prison system in which he had been raised. The judiciary that was established to enforce these protections was structured to maintain independence from political interference, while also remaining accountable to the population it served. The international relationships that he cultivated during this period of reform were based upon principles of mutual respect and beneficial cooperation, rather than the dependent relationships that had characterized Santa Prisca's previous interactions with more powerful nations, creating partnerships that could provide access to markets, technology, and expertise without compromising political sovereignty or economic autonomy. The diplomatic skills that he had developed through his enhanced intellectual capabilities proved valuable in negotiating agreements that served the island's interests. The cultural renaissance that accompanied these political and economic changes reflected renewed pride in Santa Prisca's heritage and identity that had been suppressed through generations of colonial domination and post-colonial exploitation, creating artistic and intellectual movements that celebrated the island's unique history while also engaging with contemporary global cultural developments. The festivals and cultural events that became regular features of island life provided both entertainment and education that strengthened social bonds while also attracting tourism revenue. Yet, even as these remarkable achievements accumulated, the psychological and political pressures that accompanied his role as the island's leader began to create internal tensions that threatened both his personal well-being and the stability of the reforms he had implemented. The weight of responsibility for an entire population's welfare, combined with the constant demands for decisions that could affect thousands of lives, began to generate stress responses that resembled some aspects of the enhancement-related psychological patterns he had experienced years earlier. The isolation that inevitably accompanied positions of ultimate authority created social and emotional challenges that no amount of policy success could address, as the very effectiveness of his leadership made it increasingly difficult to maintain the kinds of personal relationships that could provide emotional support and psychological stability. The advisors and colleagues who worked with him were inevitably constrained by professional relationships that prevented the kind of honest friendship that might have provided relief from the pressures of leadership. The gradual recognition that sustainable, positive change required institutional structures rather than individual leadership began to influence his thinking about long-term planning for Santa Prisca's future, creating awareness that his own eventual departure or incapacity could threaten the continuity of the reforms he had implemented unless adequate succession planning and institutional development were prioritized over immediate policy objectives. The challenge of building systems that could function effectively without his direct involvement became increasingly urgent as his successes created greater dependence upon his personal capabilities. The corrupting effects of power that he had studied in historical and philosophical texts began to manifest in subtle ways that were initially invisible to external observers, but gradually became apparent to those who knew him most intimately as the combination of authority and responsibility created psychological pressures that tested the moral frameworks he had developed during his rehabilitation. The decisions that seemed most necessary for protecting and extending his reforms sometimes required methods that conflicted with the ethical principles that had guided his development. The opposition movements that emerged in response to his reforms were funded and organized by interests that benefited from the previous systems of exploitation and corruption, creating security challenges that required responses that walked fine lines between effective protection of legitimate governance and authoritarian suppression of political dissent. The intelligence and security services that he was forced to develop to address these threats created institutional capabilities that could potentially be used to suppress legitimate opposition as well as genuine security threats. The temptation to use enhanced interrogation techniques and other methods that drew upon his knowledge of psychological manipulation and physical coercion became increasingly strong as the threats to his government's stability escalated, creating internal conflicts between his commitment to human rights principles and his determination to protect the positive changes that his leadership had accomplished. The rationalization processes that accompanied these moral compromises resembled patterns of thinking that had characterized his earlier criminal activities. The civil war that eventually erupted was triggered by foreign intervention that exploited internal divisions, while also providing military support to opposition forces that were committed to returning Santa Prisca to the previous systems of exploitation and authoritarian control, creating existential threats that seemed to justify increasingly extreme responses from government forces. The violence that resulted from this conflict undermined many of the social and economic gains that had been achieved through years of careful reform and development. The international isolation that accompanied the escalation of internal conflict was orchestrated by the same foreign interests that had supported the opposition movement, creating economic and diplomatic pressures that made it increasingly difficult to maintain the social programs and infrastructure investments that had been central to his reform agenda. The humanitarian crisis that resulted from this isolation affected precisely those populations that his government had been most committed to protecting and serving. The psychological transformation that occurred during this period of crisis and conflict involved gradual erosion of the moral constraints and ethical frameworks that had been developed during his rehabilitation, as the pressures of leadership during wartime created decision-making contexts that seemed to require choices between competing moral obligations. The utilitarian calculations that began to dominate his thinking resembled the coldly rational approach to problem-solving that had characterized his enhanced cognitive capabilities during his criminal period. The realization that his presence on the island had become a source of instability rather than positive change was perhaps the most difficult recognition of his entire life, forcing him to confront the possibility that his good intentions and reformist agenda had created more suffering than the previous systems they had been designed to replace. The weight of responsibility for the deaths and displacement that had resulted from the civil war became a psychological burden that threatened his sanity and moral coherence. The decision to leave Santa Prisca was made not from cowardice or defeat, but from recognition that his continued presence would perpetuate the conflicts that were destroying the island and its people, creating a situation where his departure represented the most constructive contribution he could make to resolving the crisis that his leadership had inadvertently created. The exile that followed was both voluntary and necessary, though it represented the abandonment of everything he had worked to achieve. The final flight from Santa Prisca took place under cover of darkness, with the same stealth and strategic planning that had characterized his original escape from Peñaduro decades earlier. Yet the psychological context was fundamentally different, as he fled not toward greater power and capability, but toward uncertain future that might never provide opportunities to repair the damage that his utopian ambitions had caused. The island that disappeared behind him in the pre-dawn darkness carried with it not only his personal dreams, but also the hopes of countless people who had believed in the possibility of genuine positive change. The philosophical reflections that occupied his thoughts during the long journey away from his homeland centered upon the fundamental questions about leadership, power, and moral responsibility that his experience had raised in the most concrete and painful possible terms, forcing him to reconsider every assumption about the relationship between good intentions and beneficial outcomes that had guided his approach to governance and social reform. The education in practical politics that he had received through failure was more valuable and more painful than any theoretical knowledge could have provided. The understanding that emerged from this period of reflection acknowledged that sustainable positive change required not heroic leadership by exceptional individuals, but rather the gradual development of institutional capabilities and social consensus that could support democratic governance without dependence upon any single person's vision or capabilities. The recognition that his own exceptionalism had been part of the problem rather than the solution challenged fundamental aspects of his identity and self-understanding in ways that would influence every subsequent decision and relationship. The return to Gotham City that marked the beginning of Bane's exile from Santa Prisca was characterized not by the confident arrival of a conqueror seeking to establish dominance over a new territory, but rather by the quiet desperation of someone whose understanding of power and responsibility had been fundamentally altered through experiences that challenged every assumption about leadership and moral authority that had previously guided his actions. The aircraft that carried him toward the familiar skyline of the city where he had achieved his greatest triumph and suffered his most significant defeat flew through storm clouds that seemed to mirror the psychological turbulence that had accompanied his journey from revolutionary leader to failed ruler to something approaching genuine wisdom. The safe house that had been prepared for his arrival existed in one of Gotham's most anonymous neighborhoods, a location chosen not for strategic advantage or operational convenience, but rather for the kind of invisibility that someone with his notorious reputation required to exist without constantly attracting the attention of law enforcement, agencies, or criminal organizations that might view his presence as either threat or opportunity. The modest apartment that became his temporary refuge bore no resemblance to the palatial accommodations he had enjoyed during his brief period as Santa Prisca's leader, yet it provided something more valuable than luxury: the solitude necessary for continued reflection upon the lessons that failure had taught him about the nature of power and the complexity of moral choice. The months that followed his return were marked by careful observation of Gotham's evolving criminal landscape and the ongoing activities of the various protagonists whose conflicts had shaped the city's character throughout the years of his absence. Yet his perspective on these familiar patterns of violence and corruption had been fundamentally altered by experiences that made it impossible to view such activities with the detached analytical interest that had once characterized his approach to urban conflict. The criminal enterprises that he observed operating throughout the city's various districts seemed petty and short-sighted when compared to the complex challenges of governance and social development that had consumed his attention during his time in Santa Prisca. The intelligence networks that he gradually re-established were designed not to support criminal operations or prepare for violent confrontations, but rather to provide the kind of comprehensive understanding of social and political dynamics that would allow him to identify opportunities for constructive contribution to the city's welfare, without drawing unwanted attention to his presence or activities. The information that flowed through these channels revealed a Gotham that had evolved in significant ways during his absence, developing new forms of corruption and new patterns of conflict that reflected the ongoing struggle between forces of order and chaos that had defined the city's character for generations. Batman's activities during this period demonstrated tactical and strategic evolution that reflected lessons learned from their previous encounters, while also revealing new approaches to crime fighting that suggested deeper understanding of the systemic problems that created the conditions in which criminal organizations could flourish. The Dark Knight's methods had become more sophisticated in their integration of detective work, technological resources, and community engagement, creating more effective and sustainable approaches to addressing urban violence than the purely reactive strategies that had characterized his earlier career. The first indirect contact between former adversaries occurred, not through dramatic confrontation or carefully orchestrated meeting, but rather through the kind of coincidental encounter that seemed to occur with surprising frequency in a city whose geography and social dynamics created inevitable intersections between individuals whose paths had crossed before. The criminal activity that brought them into proximity involved a venom distribution operation that posed threats to public safety, while also representing personal affront to someone whose own relationship with chemical enhancement had been marked by both extraordinary achievement and catastrophic failure. The investigation that followed revealed criminal networks whose sophistication and resources exceeded anything that had previously operated in Gotham's underworld. Organizations that possessed both the scientific knowledge necessary to produce high-quality enhancement compounds and the distribution capabilities required to reach markets throughout the eastern seaboard. The profits generated by these operations provided funding for expansion into other criminal activities that threatened to destabilize law enforcement efforts across multiple jurisdictions, creating strategic implications that transcended immediate concerns about drug trafficking. Batman's approach to dismantling these organizations demonstrated the kind of systematic thinking and long-term planning that Bane had learned to respect during their previous conflicts. Yet it also revealed limitations that someone with different capabilities and perspectives might be able to address through complementary rather than competitive action. The recognition that their individual strengths could be combined to achieve results that neither could accomplish alone represented a fundamental shift in their relationship that transcended personal history and previous antagonisms. The collaboration that gradually developed between them was characterized by careful, professional boundaries that acknowledged their complex shared history, while also creating space for the kind of tactical coordination that their complementary capabilities made possible, establishing working relationships that could function effectively without requiring resolution of deeper philosophical differences about methods and objectives. The trust that emerged through successful joint operations was based not on personal friendship, but rather on demonstrated reliability and commitment to shared goals that transcended individual interests or grievances. The criminal organizations that they targeted during this period of cooperation represented some of the most dangerous and sophisticated threats that Gotham had ever faced. Networks whose international connections and technological resources created challenges that required the kind of coordinated response that their combined capabilities made possible. The success of these operations demonstrated that former enemies could indeed work together effectively when circumstances created sufficient motivation and mutual respect for each other's contributions to common objectives. Yet, even as these tactical partnerships developed, deeper questions about the nature of heroism and villainy continued to complicate their interactions in ways that reflected fundamental differences in worldview and moral framework that could not be resolved through practical cooperation or professional respect. Bane's experiences with governance and social reform had created perspectives on systemic change and institutional development that often conflicted with Batman's more individualistic approach to crime fighting and community protection, generating tensions that required constant navigation and compromise. The psychological dimensions of their evolving relationship were perhaps more complex than the tactical considerations that governed their joint operations, as each served as a reminder to the other of roads not taken and choices that had defined their respective paths toward very different forms of engagement with the problems that plagued urban civilization. For Batman, Bane represented the seductive appeal of solutions that transcended legal and moral constraints, while for Bane, Batman embodied the possibility of heroism that operated within ethical boundaries while still achieving meaningful results. The philosophical debates that occasionally emerged during their quieter moments of collaboration revealed fundamental tensions between approaches to social change that emphasized institutional reform versus individual action, long-term systemic transformation versus immediate tactical intervention, and the role of violence in addressing problems that seem to resist peaceful resolution. These discussions never reached definitive conclusions, but rather provided opportunities for mutual education that enriched both participants' understanding of the complexities inherent in any serious attempt to address urban violence and social dysfunction. The temporary alliances that they formed with other individuals who possessed capabilities and resources relevant to their joint objectives created networks of cooperation that extended beyond their immediate partnership to encompass broader coalitions of people committed to protecting Gotham from threats that exceeded the capacity of any individual or organization to address alone. These relationships demonstrated the possibility of building sustainable approaches to urban security that did not depend upon the exceptional capabilities of any single person or the continuation of any particular leadership structure. The criminal masterminds who emerged to challenge these collaborative efforts possessed intelligence and resources that required new levels of strategic sophistication to counter effectively, creating opponents whose capabilities forced both Batman and Bane to evolve their methods and expand their operational frameworks in ways that pushed the boundaries of what either had previously considered possible. The confrontations with these adversaries became testing grounds for theoretical approaches to tactical coordination and strategic planning that had never been attempted under real-world conditions. The psychological addiction to conflict that both participants gradually recognized within themselves created ongoing challenges that required conscious effort to manage and redirect toward constructive rather than destructive purposes, as the excitement and sense of purpose that came from engaging in high-stakes confrontations with dangerous opponents could easily become ends in themselves, rather than means toward broader objectives of community protection and social improvement. The recognition of this tendency toward glorification of conflict created opportunities for self-examination and personal growth that neither had anticipated when their collaboration began. The media attention that inevitably accompanied their joint activities created public relations challenges that required careful management to maintain operational effectiveness, while also avoiding the kind of sensationalism that could interfere with ongoing investigations or compromise future operations. The development of communication strategies that could present their cooperation in ways that supported broader law enforcement objectives while maintaining necessary operational security required skills and perspectives that neither possessed individually but could develop through collaborative effort. The evolving relationship between former adversaries became a subject of intense speculation and analysis within both law enforcement and criminal communities, as observers struggled to understand the implications of cooperation between individuals whose previous conflicts had seemed to represent irreconcilable philosophical and tactical differences. The symbolism of their partnership extended beyond immediate operational concerns, to encompass broader questions about the possibility of redemption and the capacity for growth and change that existed within even the most hardened individuals. The gradual recognition that their partnership had become psychologically necessary for both participants created new forms of dependency that complicated their individual autonomy, while also providing sources of stability and purpose that neither had experienced through purely solitary activities. The realization that they had become mutually indispensable in ways that transcended tactical considerations forced both to confront questions about identity and independence that challenged fundamental assumptions about their respective approaches to life and work. The criminal enterprises that they continued to investigate and dismantle during this period revealed increasingly sophisticated networks of corruption and violence that extended far beyond Gotham's borders to encompass national and international organizations whose resources and capabilities posed threats to entire regions rather than individual cities. The scope of these challenges required coordination with law enforcement agencies and intelligence services that had previously viewed both Batman and Bane with suspicion or hostility, creating opportunities for rehabilitation of their respective reputations, while also demonstrating their value as assets in broader campaigns against organized crime. The technological innovations that emerged from their collaborative efforts included advances in surveillance, communication, and tactical equipment that enhanced the effectiveness of law enforcement operations, while also creating new possibilities for individual operators who possessed the training and resources necessary to employ such advanced systems effectively. The development and deployment of these technologies required careful consideration of ethical implications and potential for misuse that reflected their shared commitment to methods that could withstand moral scrutiny. The training programs that they developed to share their respective expertise with other individuals who possessed the motivation and capability to contribute to urban security efforts created multiplicative effects that extended their influence far beyond their direct operational activities, producing networks of skilled and committed individuals who could carry forward their work even in their absence or incapacity. These educational initiatives demonstrated that their most lasting contributions might come not from their individual achievements, but from their success in developing others who could continue and expand their efforts. The strategic planning sessions that became regular features of their collaboration involved analysis of emerging threats and opportunities that required long-term thinking and systematic approach to resource allocation and capability development, creating frameworks for decision-making that could function effectively under various scenarios and changing conditions. The intellectual stimulation that came from these planning exercises provided both participants with forms of mental engagement that satisfied their need for complex problem-solving while directing their analytical capabilities toward constructive rather than destructive purposes. The recognition that their relationship had evolved from simple tactical cooperation to something approaching genuine friendship created emotional dimensions that neither had expected or fully prepared to manage, as personal affection and mutual respect complicated professional relationships that had been based initially upon shared objectives rather than personal compatibility. The development of trust and emotional connection between former enemies required navigation of psychological territories that neither had explored previously, creating opportunities for personal growth that extended far beyond their collaborative work. The moments of quiet conversation that occurred between their more dramatic operational activities provided opportunities for the kind of honest self-examination and mutual understanding that could only develop through sustained interaction between individuals who possessed the intelligence and experience necessary to appreciate each other's complexity and sophistication. These discussions revealed aspects of personality and motivation that had been hidden during their adversarial relationship, creating deeper appreciation for the factors that had shaped their respective development and choices. The realization that their conflicts had been as much about mutual recognition and respect as about genuine opposition forced both to reconsider their understanding of the relationship between heroism and villainy, competition and cooperation, individual achievement and collaborative effort. The psychological dynamics that had driven their previous confrontations could be redirected toward shared objectives that served broader purposes while still providing the kind of intellectual and physical challenge that both required to maintain engagement and motivation. The legacy of their transformed relationship extended beyond their immediate activities to influence broader conversations within law enforcement and criminal justice communities about the possibility of rehabilitation and redemption for individuals whose previous actions had seemed to place them permanently beyond the reach of conventional approaches to correction and social reintegration. Their example demonstrated that even the most fundamental personal transformations remained possible given appropriate circumstances and sufficient motivation for change. The understanding that their partnership had become one of the most effective crime-fighting resources available to law enforcement agencies created both opportunities and responsibilities that required careful consideration of how their capabilities could be employed most effectively while maintaining the independence and flexibility that made their contributions valuable. The balance between cooperation with official institutions and maintenance of autonomous operational capability required ongoing negotiation and adjustment as circumstances and relationships evolved. The psychological architecture that underlies the mind of Bane represents perhaps one of the most complex and paradoxical structures ever to emerge from the intersection of extraordinary circumstances, chemical enhancement, and the fundamental human capacity for both creation and destruction that defines the species' highest achievements and most catastrophic failures. The analysis of this remarkable individual requires frameworks that transcend conventional categories of heroism and villainy to encompass deeper questions about the nature of consciousness itself and the ways that environmental pressures can shape cognitive and moral development in directions that challenge every assumption about the relationship between intelligence, power, and ethical reasoning. The foundation of Bane's psychological development was established during the earliest phases of his existence, when the traumatic circumstances of birth and upbringing in Peñaduro created neural pathways and emotional patterns that would influence every subsequent aspect of his personality and decision-making processes throughout his life. The combination of extreme stress, social isolation, and constant threat that characterized his childhood environment produced adaptations that were simultaneously advantageous for survival and destructive for normal psychological development, creating internal tensions that would manifest themselves in various forms throughout his adult relationships and activities. The intellectual capabilities that distinguished him from other inmates of the prison system were not merely the result of genetic inheritance or chemical enhancement, but also reflected the kind of focused learning that becomes possible when survival depends upon the acquisition and application of knowledge in its most practical and immediate forms. The educational program that he constructed for himself during his years of incarceration was driven by necessity rather than curiosity, creating learning patterns that emphasize tactical application over theoretical understanding, while also developing analytical frameworks that could process complex information with remarkable speed and accuracy. The emotional development that accompanied his intellectual growth was characterized by systematic suppression of vulnerabilities that could be exploited by enemies, or manipulated by those seeking to gain advantage through psychological warfare, creating personality structures that combined extraordinary empathy and insight with equally extraordinary capacity for emotional detachment and strategic deception. The ability to understand and predict human behavior that made him such an effective leader and tactician was accompanied by limited capacity for genuine emotional intimacy that reflected protective mechanisms developed during childhood, experiences of abandonment and betrayal. The enhancement process that transformed his physical and cognitive capabilities operated not merely upon his biological systems, but also upon the psychological structures that governed his approach to problem-solving and decision-making, amplifying certain aspects of his personality while suppressing others in ways that created new forms of internal conflict and tension. The chemical compounds that flowed through his enhanced physiology affected neural pathways associated with risk assessment, moral reasoning, and emotional regulation in ways that shifted his psychological equilibrium toward patterns that prioritized efficiency and results over conventional ethical considerations. The withdrawal from chemical enhancement that followed his defeat by Azrael forced him to confront aspects of his personality and motivation that had been masked or modified by pharmaceutical intervention, creating opportunities for genuine self-examination that had not been possible during the period when his consciousness was influenced by external chemical factors. The psychological pain that accompanied this withdrawal was not merely physical discomfort, but rather the emotional equivalent of awakening from dreams of omnipotence to confront the limitations and vulnerabilities that define normal human existence. The moral evolution that occurred during his rehabilitation involved systematic examination of ethical frameworks and philosophical principles that had been neglected during his pursuit of power and dominance, creating new understanding of concepts like justice, responsibility, and compassion that challenged previous assumptions about the relationship between strength and righteousness. The intellectual tools that had once been employed exclusively for tactical advantage were gradually redirected toward questions of meaning and purpose that required different forms of analysis and different standards of evaluation. The relationship between trauma and resilience that characterized his psychological development illustrates fundamental principles about human adaptability that extend far beyond individual case studies to encompass broader questions about the capacity for growth and change that exists within all conscious beings regardless of their circumstances or previous choices. The survival mechanisms that had been necessary during his imprisonment became obstacles to normal social functioning during his attempts at rehabilitation, requiring conscious effort to modify behavioral patterns that had become deeply embedded in his personality structure. The leadership capabilities that he demonstrated, both as a criminal mastermind and as a political reformer, reflected psychological patterns that combined exceptional strategic intelligence with understanding of group dynamics and individual motivation that allowed him to inspire loyalty and coordinate complex operations with remarkable effectiveness. Yet these same capabilities also created tendencies toward manipulation and control that could easily corrupt noble intentions and transform protective instincts into authoritarian impulses that caused more harm than they prevented. The capacity for violence that remained an integral part of his psychological makeup throughout all phases of his development represented not merely learned responses to threatening situations, but rather fundamental alterations in neural LI, pathways that governed threat, assessment, and response. Selection, creating permanent changes in the way his consciousness processed information about conflict and competition. The integration of this capacity for destruction with evolving moral frameworks required ongoing effort to maintain balance between protective capability and ethical restraint. The intellectual curiosity that had driven his voracious consumption of knowledge during his imprisonment continued to operate throughout his subsequent experiences, creating ongoing learning processes that modified and refined his understanding of complex social, political, and philosophical questions in ways that prevented his worldview from becoming fixed or dogmatic. The ability to assimilate new information and adapt existing frameworks to accommodate fresh insights represented one of his most valuable characteristics, and also one of his most dangerous capabilities when directed toward destructive purposes. The relationship between individual exceptionalism and social responsibility that defined many of his internal conflicts reflects broader questions about the obligations that accompany extraordinary capability and the ways that superior intelligence or physical prowess can create both opportunities and temptations that ordinary individuals never face. The recognition that his enhanced abilities created proportionally greater capacity for both positive and negative impact upon the world around him became a central component of his evolving ethical framework and decision-making processes. The psychological patterns that governed his approach to relationships with other individuals were characterized by complex combinations of loyalty and manipulation, genuine affection and strategic calculation, protective instinct and controlling behavior that reflected internal contradictions between his emotional needs and his analytical understanding of human nature. The difficulty of forming authentic connections with others who lacked his intellectual capabilities or life experiences created ongoing isolation that contributed to both his effectiveness as a leader and his vulnerability to the corrupting influences of unchecked power. The philosophical frameworks that he developed to guide his decision-making processes drew upon diverse intellectual traditions, while also incorporating insights gained through direct experience with the practical challenges, governance, conflict resolution, and social organization that theoretical knowledge alone could never provide. The synthesis of abstract principles with concrete applications that characterized his mature thinking represented intellectual achievement that transcended mere academic accomplishment to encompass genuine wisdom earned through success and failure in high-stakes situations. The tragedy of wasted potential that runs through every phase of Bane's story reflects not only individual choices and circumstances, but also broader failures of social institutions and support systems that might have channeled his remarkable capabilities toward constructive rather than destructive purposes if different interventions had been available during critical periods of his development. The recognition that his criminal activities represented misapplication of talents that could have benefited millions of people adds moral complexity to assessments of his guilt and responsibility that cannot be resolved through simple application of conventional ethical standards. The relationship between genius and madness that has been observed throughout human history finds particular expression in Bane's psychological development, as the same intellectual intensity and systematic thinking that made him extraordinarily effective also created tendencies toward obsession and rigid thinking that could distort his perception of reality and lead to catastrophic errors in judgment. The balance between analytical capability and emotional intelligence that characterizes healthy psychological functioning was disrupted by circumstances and choices that created internal tensions requiring constant management and conscious correction. The capacity for redemption that he demonstrated through his rehabilitation and subsequent attempts at constructive leadership illustrates principles about human nature that challenge deterministic assumptions about the relationship between early trauma and adult behavior, showing that even the most severe psychological damage can be addressed and partially corrected through appropriate interventions and sufficient motivation for change. The therapeutic processes that supported his moral evolution required innovative approaches that conventional psychology was not equipped to provide, creating new understanding of rehabilitation possibilities for individuals whose circumstances exceeded normal clinical experience. The isolation that inevitably accompanied his exceptional capabilities created psychological pressures that few individuals have ever been required to manage. As the combination of intellectual superiority, physical enhancement, and moral complexity that defined his identity made it virtually impossible to find others who could understand and relate to his experiences or provide the kind of peer support that ordinary people take for granted. The loneliness that resulted from this isolation contributed to decision-making patterns that prioritized grand gestures and dramatic achievements over the quieter satisfactions of normal human relationships and community involvement. The symbolic significance that Bane acquired within broader cultural narratives about heroism and villainy reflects unconscious recognition that his story contains elements that resonate with fundamental human experiences of struggle, transformation, and the search for meaning and purpose that transcend individual circumstances to encompass universal themes. The mythic dimensions of his conflicts with Batman and his attempts at social reform tap into archetypal patterns that have structured human storytelling and moral reasoning throughout recorded history. The impact that his existence had upon the development and evolution of those around him, particularly Batman, demonstrates the ways that adversarial relationships can serve constructive purposes by forcing individuals to confront their limitations and expand their capabilities in response to unprecedented challenges. The mutual influence that characterized their conflicts and eventual collaboration created learning opportunities that neither could have achieved through purely internal development, showing how external pressure and opposition can catalyze growth and change that might otherwise never occur. The questions about justice and punishment that his case raises extend far beyond individual accountability to encompass broader issues about social responsibility for creating conditions that produce exceptional individuals whose capabilities can be channeled toward either constructive or destructive purposes depending upon the support systems and guidance available during critical periods of development. The recognition that his criminal activities were partially the result of institutional failures and social neglect complicates simple narratives about personal responsibility, while also highlighting opportunities for prevention through primes, improved approaches to education, rehabilitation, and community support. The legacy that he created through both his destructive and constructive activities continues to influence discussions about leadership, governance, and social change in ways that extend far beyond the immediate consequences of his specific actions to encompass broader questions about the relationship between individual agency and systemic reform. The demonstration that even someone with his history and capabilities could evolve toward more constructive purposes provides hope for similar transformations in others, while also illustrating the immense challenges that such changes require and the fragility of progress that depends upon individual rather than institutional foundations. The philosophical implications of his story touch upon fundamental questions about human nature, moral development, and the possibilities for redemption and growth that remain available even to those whose choices have caused immense suffering and destruction. The complexity of his character and motivations resists simple moral categorization, while also providing insights into the psychological and social factors that influence the development of both heroic and villainous behavior patterns in individuals who possess extraordinary capabilities and face extraordinary circumstances. The understanding that emerges from comprehensive analysis of Bane's psychological development suggests that the traditional categories of hero and villain are inadequate frameworks for comprehending individuals whose experiences and capabilities transcend normal human limitations, requiring more sophisticated approaches to moral evaluation that can accommodate the complex relationships between trauma and resilience, intelligence and wisdom, power and responsibility that define exceptional lives. His story serves as both cautionary tale and source of hope, demonstrating the capacity for both great evil and genuine redemption that exists within human consciousness when shaped by extreme circumstances and extraordinary capabilities. In the quiet moments between conflicts, when Gotham sleeps and even its guardian rests, the legend of Bane persists as a reminder that heroes are defined not merely by their victories, but by the magnitude of the challenges they overcome. His story serves as a dark mirror, reflecting the fine line between justice and vengeance, between strength used to protect and power wielded to destroy. From the prison cells of Peñaduro to the streets of Gotham, Bane's journey speaks to the fundamental truth that we are all shaped by our circumstances, yet ultimately defined by our choices. In breaking Batman's back, he inadvertently strengthened the symbol, proving that true heroism lies not in never falling, but in rising again. Rest now, dreamer of complex moralities, and let these chronicles of darkness and redemption carry you into peaceful slumber, where the eternal struggle between light and shadow finds its resolution in dreams